Not a sound stirs, and yet the room is far from peaceful. Heavy curtains trap the air, carrying the faint tang of coal smoke, perfume, and something sharper, medicinal, sweet at the back of the throat. A woman sits still at her vanity, fingers resting lightly on a small glass bottle. It promises relief, prescribed by a man in a black coat, whose voice conveyed authority and certainty. She does not yet understand how easily the mind can be softened, reshaped, or lost entirely. In Victorian England, women were expected to endure sorrow silently, restrain anxiety with grace, and vanish their despair beneath layers of propriety. When they faltered, society offered not sympathy but medicine. Ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate substances capable of dulling memory, blurring perception, and fracturing identity were administered as routine remedies. Doctors spoke of nerves, hysteria, and delicate constitutions, while orchestrating chemical quietude that slowly dissolved individuality. Madness did not announce itself in screams. It arrived gradually, insidiously, spoon by measured spoon. In parlors scented with candle wax and coal smoke, domestic order masked private chaos. Hallucinations danced just beyond perception, memory faded, and dependence grew quietly, sanctioned by social expectation and medical authority. Calm became control, compliance, a measure of propriety, and the fog of sedation concealed a reality that few were permitted to witness. Tonight, we enter this hidden world where medicine was wielded as power, comfort became chemical obedience, and respectable homes harbored the quiet unraveling of female minds. Subscribe, settle in, and let the shadows lengthen, because this is the story of the drug that drove Victorian women to madness. The silence comes first. It settles into the room like a held breath, thick and unmoving, as if sound itself has learned to behave. Heavy curtains press against the windows, shutting out the London street beyond the carts, the hoofbeats, the calls of vendors, all muted to a distant hum. Inside, the air is warm and faintly sweet, layered with lavender water, coal smoke, and something sharper still, something medicinal that clings to the back of the throat. This is a respectable room. Everything in it says restraint, polished wood, straight-backed chairs, a small table laid carefully beside a sofa, where a woman sits, hands folded, posture perfect, eyes fixed on nothing at all. She has been taught this stillness. From girlhood onward, she learned that a woman's virtue lies in quiet endurance. Pain must be softened, emotion must be managed, grief must not spill. When the world presses too hard after childbirth, after loss, after nights without sleep, she does not cry out. She waits. And eventually, help arrives in the form Victorian society understands best: a bottle, a label, a dose. The drug rests nearby, innocent in appearance, clear glass, neatly printed instructions, a remedy prescribed by a doctor whose authority is beyond question. He spoke gently, with certainty, explaining that her nerves were overwrought, her constitution delicate, her mind too sensitive for the strain of modern life. Ether, he said, would calm her. It would steady the trembling. It would bring rest. He did not describe how it loosens the edges of thought, how it seeps quietly into perception, how the room might begin to breathe when no one else notices. This is how it begins, not with scandal, but with care. Victorian England prides itself on progress. Science advances, chemistry blooms, new substances promise mastery over pain, over fear, over the unruly body. Yet these innovations arrive in a culture already convinced that women are naturally unstable, prone to nerves, susceptible to excess emotion. The marriage of these beliefs is seamless. If a woman suffers, the fault lies not in her circumstances, but in her nature. And if her nature is flawed, it must be corrected gently, repeatedly, chemically. Ether drifts through drawing rooms and sick rooms alike, its use spreading quietly from surgical theatres into domestic life. It is colourless, volatile, deceptively light. In small doses, it produces calm. In slightly larger ones, euphoria. Taken regularly, it dissolves the boundary between wakefulness and dream, yet no alarm is raised. The effects are attributed not to the substance, but to the woman herself. Her visions are called hysteria. Her confusion is labelled weakness. Her dependence is never named at all. The home becomes a private laboratory. Respectable women administer their own medicine under the assumption of safety, guided by instructions written by men who never sit in the fog they prescribe. A spoonful before bed, another when anxiety creeps in, a third when the silence becomes unbearable. Over time, the room seems to tilt, light stretches, thoughts wander into unfamiliar corridors. The calm promised by the label arrives, but it is hollow, distant, unreal. And still, society approves. A sedated woman is a manageable woman. A quiet woman is a good woman. No one asks what price is being paid for that quiet. Behind the curtains, behind the closed doors, behind the language of propriety and care, something is unraveling. Madness does not storm in. It seeps. It curls gently around the mind, carried on vapors that smell faintly of relief. This chapter is not about collapse. It is about permission, about the moment Victorian society decided that chemical silence was preferable to female suffering, and how easily compassion became control. The ideal comes dressed in lace. It is taught early and reinforced often, woven into sermons, etiquette manuals, novels, and nursery lessons, until it feels less like instruction and more like nature itself. A proper Victorian woman is delicate. Her body is fine-boned, her nerves easily stirred, her emotions quick to swell and slow to settle. She is not built for strain, not meant to withstand excess, not expected to endure the weight of the world without assistance. Strength, when it appears, is treated as an anomaly. Endurance is praised only when it is quiet. This fragility is not merely admired, it is required. From the moment a girl enters society, her health becomes a subject of constant observation. Pallor is noted approvingly. Fatigue is interpreted as sensitivity. Tears are forgiven as long as they remain discreet. A woman who complains too loudly, who displays vigor too openly, who resists exhaustion rather than submitting to it, unsettles the order. Her body, it is assumed, is out of alignment with its proper purpose. She must be guided back into softness. Medical opinion eagerly reinforces this vision. Physicians speak with confidence about female constitutions, about wombs that wander, nerves that misfire, brains too finely tuned for intellectual or emotional strain. A woman's monthly cycles, her pregnancies, her losses, her domestic burdens, all are framed as evidence of inherent instability. The conclusion is always the same. She must be protected from herself. Protection, in practice, means restraint. A woman is discouraged from exertion, from ambition, from independence of thought. She is encouraged to rest, to recline, to retreat from stimulation. When rest fails, when nerves continue to flutter and sleep refuses to come, medicine steps in as an extension of social expectation. Drugs do not arrive as intruders. They arrive as allies, perfectly aligned with the fragile ideal that society has already constructed. Ether fits neatly into this world. It does not demand dramatic intervention. It asks only that a woman accept her own weakness, a few drops to steady the nerves, a measured dose to soften the mind. The sensation, it brings lightness, detachment. A floating calm feels almost like confirmation that the diagnosis was correct. She was, indeed, too sensitive. The world was too sharp. The drug dulls the edges, and that dullness is mistaken for healing. Yet fragility is not a fact of biology, it is a role relentlessly rehearsed. Women are taught to distrust their own strength. to interpret discomfort as failure, to believe that endurance is unfeminine and resistance dangerous. When emotional pain arises from isolation, from grief, from relentless domestic expectation, it is not named as suffering with a cause, it is named as a symptom. And symptoms, in Victorian logic, require treatment, not understanding. This belief creates a terrible loop. The more a woman is told she is delicate, the more closely she watches herself for signs of collapse. The more she notices fatigue, anxiety, or sorrow, the more readily she seeks chemical relief. The drug, in turn, deepens her passivity, blurs her clarity, weakens her resolve. What began as a social ideal becomes a self-fulfilling condition. Men, meanwhile, remain largely untouched by this narrative. Their exhaustion is framed as labor. Their emotional strain is interpreted as burden. Their suffering earns sympathy, not sedation. For women, the same feelings are medicalized, softened, dissolved into vapors and tinctures until they no longer threaten the structure of the household. The fragile ideal does not ask whether a woman is unhappy. It asks whether she is manageable. And so the drawing room becomes a theater where delicacy is performed daily. A faint smile replaces protest. A lowered gaze substitutes for anger. A small glass bottle stands ready to assist when the performance falters. Society praises the result, calling it calm, calling it grace, never asking what has been suppressed to achieve it. This is the foundation upon which chemical madness will later be built. Not sudden, not violent, but cultivated slowly through expectation and belief. Before ether ever touches the lips, the mind has already been trained to yield. They called it nerves. The word drifted through Victorian conversation with deceptive gentleness, light enough to excuse almost anything, vague enough to explain nothing. A woman was nervous. Her nerves were unsettled. Her system was overwrought. These phrases carried an air of medical authority while sparing society the discomfort of inquiry. No one needed to ask why she trembled, why she wept without warning, why sleep abandoned her night after night. The diagnosis had already absolved everyone else. Nerves were not an illness in the way fever or consumption were illnesses. They were a condition of being female, a built-in frailty, presumed rather than proven. Medical texts described women's nervous systems as finer, more delicate, more easily disturbed by emotion, thought, and sensation. The same sensitivity that supposedly made them nurturing and refined was also said to make them unstable. It was a convenient contradiction, flattering enough to be accepted, damning enough to justify control. A woman who struggled was not reacting to her circumstances, she was reacting to herself. Doctors wrote confidently of nervous exhaustion, brought on by reading too much, thinking too deeply, feeling too intensely, grief after childbirth, anxiety after marriage, melancholy after the loss of a child. These were not framed as reasonable responses to human experience, but as malfunctions of a delicate system. The solution, therefore, was not change, rest, or understanding, but intervention, chemical intervention. The language mattered. To say a woman was grieving implied loss. To say she was nervous implied defect. Once nerves entered the conversation, authority shifted. The woman's own account of her inner life became secondary to the physician's interpretation. Her words were filtered through assumptions already in place. If she described racing thoughts, they were nerves. If she described fear, it was nerves. If she described despair, the conclusion remained the same. Each symptom folded neatly into a diagnosis that required no deeper explanation. This framework made drugs not only acceptable, but necessary. Ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate, these substances promised to calm the nervous system, to quiet the misfiring signals, to restore balance to a body presumed incapable of regulating itself. They were prescribed not as last resorts, but as routine maintenance. A woman's mind, like her corset, was something to be adjusted. The irony was rarely acknowledged. The same society that overstimulated women with relentless expectation, flawless domesticity, emotional restraint, moral purity, accused them of being unable to tolerate stimulation. The noise was never external. It was always inside her. Medical journals began to fill with case descriptions that read less like science and more like moral judgment. Patients were described as excitable, impressionable, prone to fantasy. Their hallucinations, confusion, and emotional swings were recorded without reference to the substances they consumed daily. When ether-induced visions appeared, they were cited as proof of nervous instability rather than chemical effect. The drug disappeared from the narrative. The woman remained the problem. This was the genius of the nervous diagnosis. It erased cause while preserving authority. A woman might enter a doctor's care for sleeplessness and emerge months later dependent, disoriented, and emotionally flattened. Yet the progression was never questioned. Her worsening condition simply confirmed what had been assumed from the beginning. She had always been fragile. She had always been at risk. The treatment had not failed, her nature had. Even those who sensed something was wrong lacked the language to object. To challenge a diagnosis of nerves was to challenge science itself. It was to suggest that suffering might be situational rather than biological, imposed rather than inherent. Such ideas threatened the social order. Easier, far easier, to accept the explanation offered and swallow the remedy prescribed. And so nerves became the doorway through which madness quietly entered, not with chains or padded walls, but with teaspoons and calm assurances. The vocabulary of medicine smoothed the path. By the time hallucinations appeared, by the time memory fractured and identity thinned, the story had already been written. She was nervous. She always had been. The drugs would simply help her become what society expected her to be, quieter, softer, and easier to manage, even if the cost was her mind. Progress arrived quietly, carried not by fanfare but by glass bottles and confident voices. Victorian England believed deeply in advancement. Steam reshaped cities, railways collapsed distance, laboratories replaced superstition with formulas, measurements, and promises. Chemistry, once the domain of alchemists and curiosity cabinets, stepped forward as a civilizing force. Pain could be conquered, fear subdued, the body, at last, brought under rational control. And nowhere did this promise seem more welcome than in the private suffering of women. Chemical comfort did not announce itself as danger. It arrived dressed as mercy. For centuries, illness had been endured or endured poorly. Remedies were crude, outcomes uncertain. Now science offered precision, measured drops, exact grains, substances refined and isolated, their effects observed and catalogued. Doctors spoke of receptors and systems long before the public understood such words. What mattered was certainty. A woman in distress no longer had to wait. Relief could be administered immediately, predictably, repeatedly. This shift transformed the meaning of care. Previously, suffering demanded time to listen, to observe, to respond. Chemical comfort shortened that process to a transaction. A complaint entered, a prescription left. The complexity of emotion, environment, and expectation dissolved into a simple equation: symptom plus substance equals solution. It was efficient, it was modern, it was praised. Ether became emblematic of this new age. Originally confined to surgical theatres, where its power astonished crowds by rendering patients unconscious, it soon escaped those walls. If a substance could quiet the screams of the operating table, surely it could soothe the restlessness of the parlour. The logic seemed sound, the leap inevitable. Soon, ether was no longer extraordinary. It was accessible, familiar, almost domestic. Bottles found their way into medicine cabinets, alongside tonics and powders. Its volatility, once a source of caution, was reframed as elegance, a vapor that lifted pain away rather than crushing it. The sensation it produced was described in glowing terms: lightness, detachment, serenity, a chemical pause from the demands of existence. For women expected to be endlessly composed, this pause was irresistible. Chemical comfort offered what society would not. It did not argue, it did not judge, it did not ask why the burden was heavy. It simply softened perception until the burden felt distant. The room blurred. The mind loosened. Responsibility faded into a manageable haze. This was not seen as escape. It was framed as restoration. Doctors reinforced this framing with authority. Medical journals praised the reliability of chemical sedatives, contrasting them with the unpredictability of emotional treatment. Rest cures and confinement remained tools, but drugs promised something more elegant: control without force. A woman could remain at home, remain respectable, remain unseen, all while being quietly altered. The implications were profound, though rarely acknowledged. Chemical comfort shifted the locus of responsibility inward. If relief came from a bottle, then suffering must originate in the body. The world no longer needed adjustment. Relationships no longer required examination. Grief did not need space. Loneliness did not need companionship. Everything could be managed chemically, provided the dose was correct and the patient compliant. This belief aligned perfectly with Victorian moral order. A calm household was a virtuous household. A subdued woman was a functional one. Chemical comfort preserved appearances while hollowing out interior lives. The woman remained present, polite, and productive enough even as her inner clarity dimmed. No one spoke yet of addiction. Dependence was framed as necessity. Increased dosage meant worsening nerves, not chemical entanglement. When tolerance developed, it was interpreted as evidence of severity, not side effect. The solution was always more of the same. Progress demanded faith, and faith discouraged doubt. To question chemical comfort was to question science itself, an uncomfortable position in an age that worshipped advancement. It was easier to believe that relief, however artificial, was preferable to unrest. Easier to accept that serenity, however induced, was healthier than distress. And so Victorian society welcomed chemistry into its most intimate spaces, into bedrooms and birthing rooms, into sleepless nights and silent grief. The rise of chemical comfort was not driven by cruelty, but by confidence. Confidence that suffering could be managed without being understood, that calm was equivalent to health, and that a quiet woman was a cured one. The fog had begun to settle, gently, convincingly, and with the full blessing of progress, it entered medicine like a revelation. Before ether, pain was endured or restrained, flesh was held down by assistance, screams were expected, even admired as proof of fortitude. Surgery was a brutal negotiation between speed and suffering. Then, suddenly, there was silence. A patient inhaled a sweet-smelling vapor, and the body fell slack. The knife worked without resistance. When consciousness returned, the pain was gone, or at least remembered dimly, as if it had happened to someone else. Victorian society was entranced. Ether seemed almost magical, a substance that dissolved agony itself. Surgeons hailed it as a triumph of modern science, proof that chemistry could conquer even the most ancient human terror. Public demonstrations drew crowds, medical journals overflowed with praise. The language surrounding ether was reverent, bordering on spiritual. Pain, once considered inevitable, had been made optional. Yet, even in its earliest days, ether did something more than silence pain. It altered perception. Patients reported floating sensations, distorted time, vivid imagery. Some laughed, some wept, Some spoke of colors and lights that did not exist in the room. These effects were noted with curiosity, not concern. They were framed as harmless side effects, temporary detours on the road back to consciousness. The mind, it was assumed, would snap neatly back into place. That assumption would not hold. As ether's reputation spread, its use crept outward from the operating theatre. Doctors began to experiment. If ether could calm the violent shock of surgery, perhaps it could quiet lesser disturbances, anxiety, hysteria, sleeplessness. The leap felt logical, even compassionate. Why reserve relief for the scalpel when the mind itself suffered so visibly? Unlike opium, ether was fast. Its effects arrived almost immediately, blooming through the body in moments. A few inhalations were enough to produce detachment, warmth, a sense of distance from the present moment. For women overwhelmed by expectation and emotional restraint, the sensation was unlike anything else they had known. It was not sleep, not exactly. It was escape without movement. Doctors described it as gentle. Ether did not stain the skin. It did not dull speech permanently, at least not at first. It left no visible trace. A woman could inhale, compose herself, and return to her duties with a faint smile and steady hands. The vapor dissipated quickly, leaving behind only the memory of relief and the desire to feel it again. This made ether uniquely dangerous. Because it left no obvious mark, its use could expand unchecked. Bottles were kept in drawers, cabinets, bedside tables. In some households, women were instructed to administer it themselves when nerves flared. A handkerchief, a few drops, a pause, no supervision required, no follow-up questions asked. The miracle vapor fits seamlessly into the rhythms of domestic life. Unlike surgery, where ether was a dramatic intervention, its domestic use was quiet, repetitive, almost ritualistic. It became part of the private management of emotion, a solution not only to pain, but to displeasure, to restlessness, to dissatisfaction that could not be spoken aloud. Medical authority encouraged this normalization. Articles praised ether's ability to soothe without the heaviness of opiates. Its volatility was reframed as elegance, a substance that lifted distress rather than suppressing it. The very quality that made ether dangerous, its rapid effect on consciousness, was celebrated as efficiency. Few paused to consider what repeated detachment might do to the mind. Women began to describe changes that were difficult to articulate, a sense of unreality, gaps in memory, moments where the room felt unfamiliar, as though seen through glass. These complaints were rarely traced back to ether. Instead, they were folded into existing diagnoses: nerves, hysteria, emotional instability. The drug vanished from the explanation, leaving the woman alone with the blame. The miracle, it turned out, was selective. Ether could erase pain, but it could not distinguish between physical and emotional suffering. It dulled everything equally: grief, fear, identity, will. Used once, it astonished. Used repeatedly, it thinned the boundary between self and sensation. Reality lost its weight. Thought lost its edge. Still, the prescriptions continued. Victorian society did not see ether as a threat because it aligned too neatly with its values. It quieted distress. It preserved order. It allowed women to endure without protest. The miracle vapor was not merely a medical innovation. It was a social tool, dissolving discomfort before it could harden into resistance. By the time its dangers became undeniable, ether had already taught a generation of women a dangerous lesson: that calm could be chemically manufactured, and that losing oneself was an acceptable price for peace. It was never presented as excess. The instruction was always modest, almost tender. A small amount, just enough to take the edge off. A spoonful before bed. Another if the nerves refused to settle. Victorian medicine excelled at understatement, especially when the patient was a woman. Powerful substances were reduced to domestic measures, their danger softened by familiarity. What could be harmful, after all, if it fit neatly into a teaspoon? Doctors spoke in reassuring tones. They did not warn of thresholds or limits, only of balance. The goal was calm, not joy, not clarity, merely the absence of disturbance. A woman who slept was a woman restored. A woman who stopped trembling was a woman healed. How that stillness was achieved mattered far less than the fact that it appeared. The act itself became ritual. A glass bottle was uncorked with care. The liquid measured precisely, its scent sharp yet strangely inviting. Sometimes it was ether diluted and administered indirectly. Sometimes it was another sedative altogether, prescribed in the same spirit. The method varied, but the promise remained constant: relief, swift and reliable. The spoon was lifted, the dose swallowed, the waiting began. And it always worked at first. The body softened, thought slowed. The constant internal vigilance demanded of women eased its grip. For a moment, the weight of expectation lifted. No conversation required, no explanation demanded. Calm arrived without confession. This was medicine's great appeal. It bypassed the need for understanding. Over time, the spoonful became familiar, comforting even. Its presence on the bedside table was reassuring, a silent ally against the chaos of the mind. Sleeplessness no longer provoked fear. There was always a solution within reach. Anxiety no longer required articulation. It could be dissolved quietly before it became visible. But the body is not passive. Repeated exposure dulled the effect. The same dose no longer carried the same weight. The calm arrived more slowly, less completely. Doctors responded predictably. The nerves, they said, were worsening. The constitution was weakening. The treatment was adjusted accordingly. A slightly larger spoonful, a more frequent dose. The escalation felt justified, even prudent. At no point was the substance questioned. The responsibility always fell inward. If relief faded, it was because the woman herself was deteriorating. Her life, her thoughts, her emotions, these were the variables under scrutiny. The medicine remained blameless, a constant in an equation that never balanced. What began as intervention became maintenance. The spoonful was no longer reserved for nights of distress. It slipped into daily routine, a dose before receiving visitors, another before an afternoon rest. Calm became something to be preserved preemptively, as though anxiety were an infection best treated before symptoms appeared. The line between treatment and dependence blurred so gradually it was nearly invisible. Women learned to anticipate discomfort and extinguish it chemically before it could surface. The sensation of unrest itself became alarming, a signal to reach for the bottle. Natural emotion, irritation, sadness, even boredom was pathologized by association. Anything that disrupted composure was suspect. The mind adapted in ways no one recorded. Memory began to fray at the edges. Conversations slipped away. Time lost its structure, hours collapsing into one another. Some women described feeling distant from their own thoughts, as though observing themselves from across the room. Others reported moments of panic when the calm failed to arrive, when the spoonful did not deliver what it once promised. These reactions were not interpreted as warning signs. Instead, they reinforced the diagnosis: severe nerves, emotional instability, a fragile temperament unable to cope without assistance. The solution, again, was more careful dosing, more attention to routine, more discipline, more chemical calm. The spoon, so small and precise, masked the scale of what was happening. Victorian medicine favored gradualism. Harm that arrived slowly was easier to deny. There were no sudden collapses, no dramatic overdoses to force acknowledgement. There was only a quiet transformation, a woman growing softer, quieter, more compliant, less present. Her distress diminished, yes, but so did everything else. And society approved. A woman who no longer complained was a success story. A woman who slept through her own dissatisfaction was a triumph of care. The spoonful of calm did exactly what it was meant to do: not heal, but manage. Not restore, but contain. By the time the calm became necessary just to feel normal, the ritual was complete. The spoon was no longer medicine. It was permission to exist without fully feeling, to endure without resisting, to disappear gently while remaining in plain sight. It tasted faintly bitter, easily hidden beneath sugar or cordial. Laudanum did not announce itself as danger. It arrived dissolved in familiarity, folded into the rituals of Victorian life so completely that its presence barely registered as extraordinary. A few drops in tea, a measure stirred into wine, a remedy taken as casually as one might take broth for a chill. Opium, refined and respectable, entered the home not as a narcotic, but as comfort sanctioned, endorsed, and trusted. By the middle of the 19th century, laudanum was everywhere. It was prescribed for pain, for sleeplessness, for coughs, for menstrual distress, for grief that lingered too long. It was recommended after childbirth and during pregnancy, during periods of anxiety and seasons of melancholy. Doctors praised its versatility, its reliability, its ability to quiet the body and soothe the mind. Pharmacists sold it freely. Mothers kept it within reach. No stigma clung to it. Laudanum was medicine. For women, its appeal was immediate. Unlike ether's sharp volatility, laudanum offered a deeper softness. It did not lift the mind into lightness. It wrapped it in warmth. Thoughts slowed, emotions dulled. The sharp edges of feeling rounded off into something tolerable. For women trained to suppress distress rather than express it, this felt like relief at last, a chemical embrace that asked nothing in return. The teacup became the perfect vessel. Tea was already associated with calm, with propriety, with the rhythms of domestic life. To add laudanum to it required no change in habit, no disruption of routine. A woman could medicate herself while maintaining every outward sign of respectability. She could sip her sedation beneath polite conversation, her inner world growing quieter with every swallow. This quiet was celebrated. Victorian culture prized composure above all else. A woman who bore her suffering without complaint was admired. Laudanum made this possible. It transformed anguish into stillness, despair into passivity. Where ether blurred perception, laudanum smoothed it, pressing emotion flat until it no longer resisted. But opium does not merely calm, it binds. The body adapts quickly. What once required a few drops soon demanded more. Tolerance crept in silently, mistaken for worsening symptoms rather than chemical dependence. Doctors responded predictably, increasing doses, extending prescriptions. The solution was always quantitative, never conceptual. If calm faded, more calm was required. No one spoke yet of addiction. That word belonged to the streets, to opium dens and fallen men. Laudanum, taken in parlors and bedrooms, escaped such judgment. When women began to show signs of dependency, irritability without the drug, trembling hands, profound lethargy, these were attributed to nerves, to feminine weakness, to moral frailty. The substance itself remained beyond reproach. Medical records from the era reveal a telling pattern. Women described fogged thoughts, emotional numbness, strange dreams, a sense of drifting through their own lives. These complaints were carefully noted, then promptly reinterpreted. The drug was not causing these sensations, physicians insisted. It was merely revealing the underlying instability that had always been there. Laudanum did not create weakness, it exposed it. This logic protected the system. By framing opium as cure rather than cause, Victorian medicine absolved itself of responsibility. The woman's mind became the site of failure, her body the unreliable instrument. The laudanum bottle remained a symbol of care, even as it quietly rewrote her inner landscape. Dependence deepened unnoticed because it resembled virtue. A sedated woman was patient. A dulled woman was agreeable. Emotional flattening looked like improvement. Families praised the transformation. Doctors cited success. Society nodded approvingly as women faded into manageable versions of themselves. And so, laudanum did its work in silence. Not through excess, but through normalization. Not through scandal, but through routine. It taught women that unbearable feelings could be softened chemically, that endurance could be outsourced to a bottle, that peace did not require change, only compliance. By the time the teacup was empty, something essential had been drained with it. Clarity, urgency, the capacity to resist. Laudanum did not drive women to madness all at once. It lulled them there gently, persuading them that numbness was health and surrender was calm. The fog thickened, sweetened, and settled one polite sip at a time. Sleep, when it finally came, no longer belonged to the body. Victorian medicine spoke of it as restoration, a necessary return to balance, a nightly repair of the frayed nervous system. Yet for many women, natural sleep had become elusive. Minds raced in the dark, thoughts circled without resolution. The expectations of the day lingered into the night, unspoken and unresolved. Insomnia was not treated as a symptom of strain or sorrow, but as another failure of feminine constitution, further proof that the nerves were misaligned. Chloral hydrate arrived as the answer. Discovered in the middle of the century and quickly embraced by physicians, it promised what ether and laudanum could not fully deliver: unconsciousness without struggle, not drifting, not soft detachment, but sleep deep, immediate, and seemingly complete. Doctors praised it as scientific precision made liquid, a sedative that bypassed emotion entirely and went straight to the nervous system itself. For women desperate for rest, it felt like mercy. A measured dose could silence the mind within minutes. Thoughts collapsed, awareness vanished. The long vigil of the night ended abruptly, without negotiation. For the first time in weeks or months, a woman could lie down and disappear. Morning arrived with the illusion of renewal. Even if the body felt heavy, the head thick, the soul slightly misaligned. This sleep, however, was not rest. Chloral hydrate did not follow the rhythms of the body. It imposed stillness chemically, forcing the brain into a state that resembled sleep but lacked its restoration. Dreams became fragmented or vanished entirely. Waking brought confusion rather than clarity. Yet these effects were dismissed as temporary inconveniences, minor costs, in exchange for the miracle of unconsciousness. Doctors reassured their patients. Artificial sleep, they said, was better than none at all. As prescriptions spread, chloral hydrate slipped easily into domestic life. Like ether and laudanum before it, it was framed as modern, controlled, respectable. It did not carry the stigma of opium. It did not intoxicate visibly. A woman could take it nightly and still rise, dress, and fulfill her duties with outward normalcy. Its efficiency made it popular. Its silence made it dangerous. Tolerance developed swiftly. What worked once failed the next night. The dose was adjusted upward, then again. Physicians attributed this to severe insomnia, worsening nerves, heightened sensitivity. The drug itself was rarely blamed. Instead, the woman's condition was said to be deteriorating, justifying further intervention. Sleep, once natural, became something that had to be forced. Dependence followed quietly. Women began to fear wakefulness itself. The night became a threat, a space where unmedicated thought could return. Chloral hydrate offered escape not from pain, but from consciousness. Over time, some women found they could not sleep at all without it. Others experienced sudden awakenings, heart palpitations, vivid hallucinations at the edge of consciousness. These reactions were noted with concern, but not alarm. They were treated as symptoms, not signals. Medical journals recorded cases of confusion, emotional flattening, memory loss. Women reported feeling detached from their own lives, as though moving through days half asleep. Some experienced deep despair upon waking, an inexplicable emptiness that clung even after the drug wore off. Physicians responded by fine-tuning dosages, combining chloral with other sedatives, layering chemicals in pursuit of calm. The goal was never to restore natural sleep. It was to suppress disturbance. Artificial sleep served Victorian society well. A sleeping woman was not disruptive. She did not question. She did not demand. She did not cry out in the night where others might hear. Chloral hydrate turned restlessness into absence, ensuring that even unconscious hours were regulated. In time, the boundary between night and day eroded. Women carried the heaviness of artificial sleep into waking life. Reactions slowed. Emotions dulled. The mind, deprived of true rest, began to fracture in subtle ways. Hallucinations crept in at the edges of awareness. Moments of unreality multiplied, yet these changes were rarely traced back to the drug. Instead, they reinforced existing beliefs about feminine instability. Once again, medicine declared victory too soon. Chloral hydrate did not cure sleeplessness, it silenced it. It replaced one form of suffering with another, quieter, less visible, more acceptable. The woman lay still in the dark, her mind chemically extinguished, her body obedient at last. Sleep had been achieved. But the cost was waking life itself. The bottle came with instructions, but not with truth. Victorian prescriptions were written with confident strokes, ink pressed firmly into paper, as though certainty itself could be transferred through handwriting. Dosage, frequency, occasion. Everything a woman was permitted to know was neatly contained in those few lines. What was missing mattered far more. There were no cautions about the mind, no explanations of dependence, no acknowledgement that the medicine itself might reshape the very nerves it claimed to heal. Silence was part of the treatment. Doctors believed deeply in authority, not only their own, but authority as a moral necessity. To burden a patient with too much information was considered dangerous, especially when that patient was a woman. Fear, it was said, could worsen symptoms. Doubt could agitate the nerves. Better to reassure, better to simplify, better to prescribe and expect obedience. And so warnings were withheld in the name of care. Ether was described as calming, never disorienting. Laudanum was praised for comfort, never for bondage. Chloral hydrate was presented as sleep, never as erasure. The language was deliberate, carefully chosen to inspire trust rather than understanding. Women were not expected to weigh risks, they were expected to comply. This imbalance of knowledge was profound. Physicians, by the late 19th century, were not ignorant of side effects. Medical journals contained discussions of tolerance, habituation, mental confusion, and emotional blunting. Some even hinted at long-term damage. But these conversations remained confined to professional circles. They did not reach the drawing room. They were not shared with the woman swallowing the dose. In practice, ignorance was cultivated. A woman experiencing new symptoms after beginning treatment was rarely told they might be related to the drug. If she reported dizziness, it was her nerves. If she described vivid dreams or waking confusion, it was hysteria. If she felt detached from her own emotions, it was emotional weakness. The prescription was never implicated. To suggest otherwise would undermine the authority that held the entire system together. Warnings would have required dialogue. Dialogue implied equality. Instead, the relationship between doctor and female patient was structured as instruction and compliance. The physician spoke. The woman listened. Her role was not to question, but to follow. Trust was demanded, not earned. This dynamic ensured that responsibility for harm never flowed upward. When something went wrong, it was the patient who had failed, not the treatment. Families reinforced this structure. Husbands, mothers, sisters accepted medical authority without hesitation. A woman's worsening condition was interpreted as proof that she was more fragile than previously thought. Increased medication was seen as compassion. Withdrawal was seen as neglect. Few stopped to consider whether the treatment itself was deepening the problem. The absence of warning created a dangerous illusion of safety. Because no immediate catastrophe followed the first dose, the medicine appeared benign. Because decline was gradual, it was invisible. Weeks blurred into months. The woman who had once been anxious but alert became calm but distant. The change was subtle enough to escape alarm, dramatic enough to alter her inner life completely. When fear finally surfaced, it was redirected. Some women sensed something slipping away: memory, clarity, will. They attempted to articulate this unease, only to be reassured that such thoughts were themselves symptoms. Doubt was pathologized. Questioning became evidence of instability. The medicine, once trusted, now guarded itself by framing skepticism as illness. In this way, silence became self-perpetuating. Prescriptions without warnings did more than conceal risk. They shaped interpretation. They taught women to mistrust their own perceptions and defer to authority, even when their lived experience contradicted it. This erosion of self-trust was as damaging as the chemicals themselves. By the time dependence became undeniable, the framework was already in place to deny it. A woman who could not function without her medicine was not addicted. She was severely nervous. A woman who panicked when a dose was missed was not chemically dependent. She was constitutionally weak. The words protected the practice. The practice protected the system. No warning was ever given that calm could become captivity. No label mentioned that identity might thin, that emotion might flatten, that thought itself might slow into something unrecognizable. Those truths lived only in private terror, unrecorded and unacknowledged. The prescription ended where obedience began. Everything that followed, confusion, dependence, dissolution, was left for the woman to endure alone, quietly, exactly as Victorian society expected her to do. He entered the room with certainty. Victorian doctors carried themselves with an assurance that brooked no resistance. Dark coats, measured voices, instruments polished to a dull gleam. Their presence alone signaled order, reason, and control, qualities society valued deeply, and qualities women were presumed to lack. When a physician spoke, his words were not merely advice. They were instruction, grounded in science, sanctioned by tradition, and reinforced by law. Trust was not optional, it was expected. Medicine in the 19th century positioned itself as a moral force as much as a scientific one. The doctor was not only a healer of bodies, but a guardian of propriety, a stabilizing presence in a world of emotional excess. This role aligned neatly with prevailing views of womanhood. A woman's suffering required guidance. Her uncertainty demanded correction. Her distress, once identified, became the doctor's domain. Authority flowed in one direction. Women were rarely invited into the logic of their own treatment. Diagnoses were delivered, not discussed. Prescriptions were given, not negotiated. The assumption was simple and absolute. The physician knew best. His training, his education, his gender placed him beyond question. To doubt him was to doubt progress itself. This trust was cultivated deliberately. Medical language was cloaked in reassurance. Doctors spoke of balance, regulation, and calm words that suggested care rather than control. They framed their interventions as necessary responses to feminine fragility, reinforcing the belief that women required supervision for their own good. The more vulnerable a woman appeared, the more justified the authority became. Chemical treatment fit perfectly within this hierarchy. Drugs allowed doctors to extend their influence beyond the consultation. A prescription ensured compliance long after the visit ended. Even in the physician's absence, his authority lingered in the bottle, dictating dosage, timing, and behavior. The woman became both patient and custodian of her own restraint, administering discipline to herself under medical instruction. When outcomes were favorable or appeared to be, the system congratulated itself. A woman who slept better, spoke less, and appeared calmer was evidence of success. Her interior state was irrelevant. What mattered was observable order. Doctors recorded improvements in tone, demeanor, and compliance, rarely asking whether the treatment had altered her sense of self. Authority measured results externally, not experientially. When outcomes were not favorable, authority protected itself. If a woman worsened, the explanation was already prepared. She had been more unstable than anticipated, her nerves were severely compromised, her constitution was unusually weak. The authority of the physician remained intact, insulated by assumptions that placed blame firmly on the patient. This dynamic made resistance nearly impossible. A woman who questioned her treatment risked being labeled difficult, emotional, or hysterical diagnoses that justified further intervention. Her protest became proof of pathology. Silence, therefore, was safer. Compliance was rewarded with approval. Obedience became a survival strategy. Families reinforced the doctor's authority without hesitation. Husbands deferred to medical expertise, often relieved to hand responsibility over to a professional. Mothers trusted prescriptions that promised calm daughters. Sisters encouraged compliance in the name of health. The physician's word outweighed personal observation, emotional intuition, even lived experience. Authority thrived on distance. Doctors rarely remained long enough to witness the cumulative effects of their prescriptions. They saw snapshots, brief consultations, separated by weeks or months. The slow erosion of clarity, the creeping dependence, the emotional flattening unfolded in private, away from the clinical gaze. When patients returned altered, the change was attributed to illness, not intervention. This separation allowed harm to masquerade as care. Medical journals spoke confidently of success rates and therapeutic benefits, rarely acknowledging the voices of those treated. Women's accounts, when recorded at all, were filtered through professional interpretation. Their words lost authority the moment they conflicted with doctrine. Trust, once established, became self-sustaining. The doctor's role as trusted authority ensured that chemical intervention could continue without scrutiny. Ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate passed from hand to hand under the seal of expertise. Each prescription reinforced the system that produced it. In this world, to trust the doctor was to surrender judgment. The woman's body became a site of experimentation carried out in good faith and unquestioned power. Her mind absorbed the consequences quietly, reshaped under the weight of authority she had been taught never to challenge. And so the trusted authority stood firm, calm, confident, unassailable, while beneath that certainty lives softened, blurred, and slowly slipped beyond recognition, all in the name of care. Grief, in Victorian England, was permitted but only briefly, and only in prescribed forms. A woman might weep after a death. She might withdraw for a time, dress in black, speak softly of loss. These rituals were accepted, even expected, but grief that lingered unsettled the social order. Mourning that did not resolve itself into quiet endurance became suspect. When sorrow refused to fade, it ceased to be seen as a natural response and instead became a medical problem waiting to be named. The transition was subtle, almost courteous. A woman who lost a child was expected to suffer, but not indefinitely. A wife widowed too young was allowed tears, but not despair. A mother exhausted by childbirth was granted sympathy, but not collapse. The boundary between acceptable grief and pathological grief was never clearly drawn. It was felt rather than defined, enforced through glances, whispers, and finally, professional concern. At the first consultation, the language shifted. What had been described as heartbreak became melancholia. What had been called exhaustion became nervous depletion. Sleepless nights spent replaying loss were reframed as insomnia of the hysterical type. The event itself, the death, the trauma, the isolation, began to recede from view. The focus turned inward toward the woman's supposed inability to recover properly. Grief was no longer something that happened to her. It was something wrong with her. Doctors listened politely as women spoke of absence, of silence in once familiar rooms, of days that felt unanchored without the presence they had lost. Then, gently, decisively, they redirected the conversation. Such feelings were understandable, of course, but excessive. Prolonged sorrow was said to strain the nerves, to weaken the system, to invite further instability. Intervention was necessary, not to address the cause, but to suppress the response. This was how grief became diagnosis. Once named, it could be treated. And treatment, increasingly, meant chemicals. Ether to calm the racing thoughts, laudanum to soften the ache, chloral hydrate to enforce sleep when dreams became unbearable. The grief itself was not resolved, it was anesthetized. The woman was guided away from feeling rather than through it. Society approved of this transformation. A grieving woman was disruptive. She reminded others of vulnerability, of death, of the fragility beneath propriety. A medicated woman was manageable. Her sorrow became quieter, less visible, easier to ignore. What could not be spoken was dissolved into calm. The medical record reflected this shift mercilessly. Case notes described patients as lingering in sorrow, unable to resume duties, fixated on loss. The language carried impatience, thinly veiled as concern. Emotional persistence was treated as defiance. The prescribed response was sedation not as punishment, but as correction. Women internalized this judgment. They learned to distrust their own mourning, to see prolonged sadness as failure rather than process. When the ache did not fade, they blamed themselves. When the drugs dulled the pain, they felt relief tinged with shame, relief that they were finally becoming acceptable again. Yet grief does not vanish when silenced. Under chemical calm, it lingered unresolved, reshaped into something stranger. Women reported a numbness that frightened them more than sorrow had. They described feeling detached from memories that once defined them, as though love itself had been flattened by the treatment. Some feared they were forgetting the very people they mourned. These fears were rarely addressed. Doctors reassured them that such sensations were signs of improvement, evidence that the emotional excess had been successfully reduced. To feel less was to heal. To remember less vividly was to move forward. The framing was relentless and difficult to escape. In time, the diagnosis eclipsed the loss entirely. What began as grief became a permanent identity, a nervous woman, a melancholic patient, someone prone to instability. The original wound disappeared beneath layers of medical language and ongoing prescription. The drugs remained. The sorrow was never allowed to speak again. This was the quiet cruelty of Victorian medicine. It did not deny grief outright. It reclassified it. It transformed human response into pathology and then congratulated itself for suppressing the symptoms. Women were not encouraged to mourn. They were encouraged to recover quickly and chemically. From grief to diagnosis, the journey was swift and socially sanctioned, and once sorrow had been labeled illness, the door opened wide for a lifetime of treatment not to heal the heart, but to keep it silent. Obedience, when achieved quietly, was mistaken for health. Victorian society prized order above comfort, composure above truth. The ideal woman did not challenge, did not demand, did not disrupt. She adapted, she endured. When adaptation failed, chemistry stepped in to finish the work. What sermons and etiquette could not fully enforce, medicine accomplished with remarkable efficiency. Drugs did not merely soothe symptoms, they shaped behavior. Ether softened resistance by dissolving urgency. Laudanum dulled protest by wrapping emotion in warmth. Chloral hydrate erased wakefulness itself, removing the hours in which doubt might form. Together, these substances created a chemical environment where compliance flourished naturally. A woman under their influence was less likely to argue, less inclined to question, less capable of sustained opposition. Calm was not just a sensation, it was a state of submission. This was not framed as control, it was framed as care. Doctors spoke of regulating excess, of restoring balance, of protecting fragile systems from harm. Yet the behaviors being regulated were not dangerous in themselves. Anxiety, anger, dissatisfaction, grief, these were human responses to constrained lives. Victorian medicine did not ask why these feelings arose, it asked only how quickly they could be suppressed. The chemistry was precise in its effect. Under sedation, a woman's emotional range narrowed, extremes flattened, reactions slowed. The sharpness required for refusal softened into passivity. Decisions felt heavier, effortful. It became easier to agree than to resist, easier to comply than to explain. This was not weakness of character, it was neurochemical reality. Families noticed the change and often welcomed it. A calmer wife meant a quieter household. A subdued daughter meant fewer concerns. The woman appeared improved, more even-tempered, more manageable, less demanding of attention. These changes were interpreted as evidence of successful treatment. The cost diminished agency, eroded, will remained unexamined. Obedience thrived because it looked like virtue. Victorian morality already equated goodness with restraint. Drugs simply accelerated the process. Chemical calm made it easier for women to embody the ideals expected of them. They spoke less. They questioned less. They accepted more. Medicine had achieved what social pressure alone could not guarantee. Importantly, this obedience did not feel imposed. That was the genius of chemical control. There were no chains, no locked doors, no overt coercion. The woman administered the discipline herself, following instructions she trusted. Each dose felt like a choice, even as it narrowed the capacity to choose. Compliance became internalized, enforced not by threat but by chemistry. When women sensed something slipping away, ambition, clarity, anger, they struggled to articulate it. Language failed where sensation blurred. The drugs did not create a dramatic loss of self, they thinned it gradually. Identity faded like ink left too long in the sun. What remained was functional, polite, and acceptable. A woman might feel diminished without knowing how to explain why. When she tried, the attempt itself was framed as evidence of instability. Resistance, when it appeared, was swiftly corrected. A woman who refused her medicine was described as uncooperative, irrational, or dangerously excitable. Such refusal justified stronger intervention, increased dosage, closer supervision. In some cases, confinement. Obedience was not optional, it was necessary for her own good. Medical authority provided the final justification. Doctors reassured families that treatment prevented greater harm, breakdowns, outbursts, public embarrassment. The implication was clear. Without chemical restraint, women were risks to themselves and others. Obedience was reframed as safety, submission as protection. And so chemistry became an invisible governor of behavior. It regulated tone, pace, and response. It smoothed over conflict before it could surface. It ensured that dissatisfaction never gathered enough force to demand change. The drugs did not resolve injustice or alleviate burden. They made endurance easier. In this way, Victorian medicine did not merely treat women. It trained them to accept, to adapt, to comply, to disappear gently into the roles prescribed for them. The chemistry of obedience worked not by force, but by persuasion, persuading the mind to surrender its edges, persuading the self to become smaller in exchange for peace. By the time the fog lifted, if it ever did, the habit of obedience remained, not imposed from without, but absorbed, internalized, and reinforced by every carefully measured dose. They began as flickers, easily dismissed. A shadow moved where no one stood. A sound lingered after its source had vanished. Light seemed to stretch, bending softly at the edges of the room. Women noticed these disturbances quietly, uncertain whether to trust their own senses. Victorian life already demanded restraint of perception. Emotion was suspect, imagination dangerous, so these moments were folded inward rather than spoken aloud. Gaslight made everything worse. The flickering glow that illuminated parlors and bedrooms cast long, shifting shadows that refused to stay still. Under its influence, walls breathed, faces changed subtly, corners darkened without warning. For women already softened by sedatives, the boundary between external light and internal sensation grew dangerously thin. Ether loosened perception. Laudanum blurred memory. Chloral hydrate fractured sleep itself. Together, they created fertile ground for visions. The hallucinations did not arrive violently. They drifted in, gentle and confusing. A woman might see patterns ripple across wallpaper, feel the presence of someone just beyond sight, hear her name whispered in familiar voices. These experiences were unsettling, but not terrifying, at least not at first. They felt intimate, personal, as though the mind were revealing something hidden rather than malfunctioning. Many women feared speaking of them. Victorian culture punished unreliability. To admit seeing what others could not was to risk being labeled unstable. Instead, women tested reality privately. They blinked. They touched surfaces to confirm solidity. They repeated conversations aloud to ensure they had truly occurred. When uncertainty persisted, they assumed fault lay within themselves. Doctors rarely connected these visions to medication. When women finally gathered the courage to describe their experiences, physicians listened with practiced detachment. Hallucinations, they said, were not uncommon among the nervously inclined. Sensitive minds were prone to fantasy. Emotional excess could produce vivid imaginings. The explanation was neat, reassuring, and deeply misleading. The drugs vanished from the conversation. Ether-induced distortions of perception were framed as hysteria. Laudanum dreams, spilling into waking life, were interpreted as weakness of will. Chloral's fragmented sleep states were described as constitutional vulnerability. Each symptom reinforced the diagnosis already in place. The woman's mind was unstable. The treatment was necessary. Gaslight amplified this misinterpretation. The flicker of lamps provided plausible deniability. If a shadow moved strangely, it could be blamed on lighting. If a face appeared altered, it could be dismissed as fatigue. The environment itself collaborated in obscuring cause. Hallucinations blended seamlessly with the visual distortions of the age. As doses increased, visions grew more elaborate. Some women described vivid scenes unfolding in familiar rooms, landscapes layered over furniture, figures appearing briefly before dissolving. Others experienced distortions of time, moments stretching unbearably or collapsing without warning. A few heard music or voices with unsettling clarity, as though another world were pressing close. These experiences were not treated as emergencies. Instead, they were catalogued as symptoms of advanced nervous disorder. Treatment intensified, more sedation, more enforced rest. The logic was relentless. Hallucinations proved instability. Instability required stronger intervention. No one paused to ask whether the intervention itself was the source. Women began to doubt reality itself. When perception could not be trusted, judgment faltered, confidence eroded. The mind, already softened by chemicals, struggled to anchor itself. Some women withdrew entirely, fearing their own senses. Others clung desperately to external authority, accepting whatever explanation was offered because their inner compass no longer pointed true. This surrender deepened dependence. If the mind could deceive, then only medicine could correct it. If perception was unreliable, then obedience became survival. Hallucinations, rather than prompting caution, strengthened the grip of treatment. Gaslight, drugs, and authority formed a closed loop. Each reinforced the other, creating a world where altered perception was normalized as illness rather than recognized as harm. The woman stood at the center of this loop, disoriented and increasingly isolated, her experiences filtered and reframed until they no longer belonged to her. By the time fear replaced confusion, the ground had already shifted. Hallucinations were no longer anomalies. They were evidence used to justify confinement, heavier sedation, closer control. What began as chemical side effects became permanent marks against credibility. Under the soft glow of gaslight, reality thinned. Walls whispered, shadows lingered. The mind, untethered by chemistry and unsupported by truth, drifted toward madness, not because it was broken, but because it was repeatedly taught to mistrust itself. The visions were not signs of inherent instability. They were signals ignored, warning flares dissolving quietly into the Victorian night. At first, it was occasional, a dose taken only when the nerves refused to settle, a spoonful reserved for nights when sleep would not come. The medicine existed as a solution, not a habit, a tool to be used sparingly, responsibly, under the guidance of authority. Women reassured themselves of this distinction. They were not dependent, they were simply careful. But repetition has a quiet power. Relief, once experienced, reshapes expectation. The mind remembers ease more vividly than pain, and soon the absence of discomfort feels unnatural, even alarming. A woman who has learned that calm can be summoned from a bottle begins to notice unrest more sharply. The smallest flicker of anxiety becomes intolerable when a remedy is within reach. The ritual forms slowly. The bottle is moved closer from cabinet to bedside, from drawer to table. The timing becomes predictable. Evening approaches, and with it, the familiar anticipation of relief. The hand reaches for the glass before distress fully registers. What was once reaction becomes preparation. Calm is no longer a response to suffering. It is a requirement for facing the day. This transition is rarely acknowledged. Victorian medicine did not recognize ritual as danger. Habit was not yet language for dependence. Instead, regular dosing was framed as good management. Consistency was praised. Discipline admired. A woman who took her medicine faithfully was responsible, not compromised. The ritual offered more than relief. It offered certainty. Life for Victorian women was crowded with demands and stripped of agency. Decisions were made for them, expectations imposed without consultation. The ritual of medication, paradoxically, felt like control. Measuring the dose, choosing the moment, administering calm at will. It was a small autonomy, purchased chemically. Over time, the ritual became symbolic. The act of taking medicine signaled safety. Without it, the world felt too sharp, too loud, too demanding. The mind anticipated collapse if the routine was disrupted. Anxiety attached itself not to life's events, but to the possibility of missing a dose. Physicians misread this attachment. When women reported distress at the thought of delay or omission, doctors interpreted it as evidence of severe nerves. The solution was predictable: reinforce the routine, ensure compliance, avoid disruption. The ritual was protected rather than questioned. Family members noticed the transformation. A woman once animated by thought or feeling now moved through her days with practiced calm. Her speech slowed, her reactions softened. She became reliable, predictable, manageable. These changes were praised as improvement. The ritual was credited with restoring balance. No one asked what had been sacrificed. As dependence deepened, the ritual demanded loyalty. Missed doses produced agitation, confusion, physical discomfort. These sensations were alarming, reinforcing the belief that the medicine was essential. The body, now adapted, protested withdrawal. The mind, dulled by repetition, interpreted this protest as proof of fragility rather than consequence. The ritual tightened its grip invisibly. There were no dramatic moments of realization, no sudden acknowledgements of captivity. Instead, there was accommodation. Adjustments made quietly to preserve routine. Excuses offered to explain away discomfort. The ritual folded seamlessly into daily life, indistinguishable from necessity. In this way, relief ceased to be relief. It became maintenance, obligation, the baseline against which all experience was measured. Without it, the woman felt unmoored, exposed, incapable of functioning. With it, she felt diminished but safe. The choice, though never framed as such, was clear. Medicine had become ceremony. Each dose reaffirmed submission, not consciously, but chemically. The ritual replaced dialogue, introspection, resistance. It taught the body to expect sedation and the mind to avoid unrest at any cost. Victorian society applauded the outcome. A woman bound by ritual was not disruptive. She did not challenge norms. She did not demand change. Her compliance appeared voluntary, her calm admirable. The ritual accomplished what authority alone could not. By the time relief turned to ritual, the transformation was complete. The medicine no longer addressed suffering. It preserved silence, and silence, once achieved, became the highest good, maintained carefully, reverently, one measured dose at a time. Madness did not always arrive as spectacle. In Victorian England, it often crept quietly into parlors and bedrooms, arriving not with cries or chains, but with the soft hiss of a bottle being uncorked. It was subtle at first, hidden behind polite conversation and composed faces. A slip of memory here, a fleeting misperception there, the early signs easily rationalized as fatigue, nerves, or oversensitivity. The household observed nothing unusual, or if it did, it was excused. Madness was private, intimate, and entirely unacknowledged. The home became a stage for this unseen decline. Curtains drawn against the grey London light, gas lamps flickering over polished wood. Women moved through carefully arranged rooms with graceful precision. Their actions suggested control, normality, decorum. Yet behind each measured gesture lay the quiet consequences of chemical intervention. Ether dulled awareness. Laudanum smoothed reaction. Chloral hydrate enforced rest. Each substance bent perception, diminished resistance, and blurred the edges of identity. Slowly, the self began to fray, unnoticed by the very people most attentive to appearances. Family and visitors reinforced the illusion. Polite inquiries were answered with calm nods and measured words. Complaints were tempered, misremembered incidents brushed off. Observation focused on behavior rather than interior life. A woman who complied, who carried herself with restraint, was considered stable. The private unraveling, hidden behind obedient silence, remained invisible. Society, in its pursuit of propriety, trained itself not to see. Medical authority sanctioned this invisibility. Doctors prescribed in the name of care, unaware or unconcerned with the gradual erosion occurring behind closed doors. Hallucinations were reframed as nervous symptoms. Memory lapses were called weakness. Emotional flattening was deemed restoration. Each note in a ledger confirmed what society already assumed. The woman was delicate, and treatment was justified. The chemical agents themselves were excused from scrutiny. They were tools of correction, not contributors to decline. Isolation magnified the effect. A woman suffering privately had few allies. Confidantes risked judgment, siblings were instructed by propriety, and husbands' assumed responsibility lay with medical expertise. Voices capable of questioning the treatment or advocating caution were rare. Loneliness intensified the mind's vulnerability, providing fertile ground for the creeping distortions of perception and memory that defined early madness. Symptoms grew gradually. Fleeting hallucinations, brief confusions, and distorted sensations slowly became persistent. Shadows seemed alive. Sounds were misinterpreted. Time lost its clarity. The world appeared unsteady, as if the parlor itself were breathing and shifting. Chemical sedation muted fear, but it could not fully erase the recognition that something was wrong. A woman might note the oddities in private journals, whispered to herself, never aloud, internalizing uncertainty as weakness. Dependence intertwined with decline. Each dose that promised calm became essential for functioning. Fear of wakefulness, of clarity, of facing the day unmedicated, reinforced adherence. Private madness was both cause and consequence of chemical reliance. The rituals of dosing, once optional, became mandatory. The self, already softened, surrendered to routine, reinforcing both submission and isolation. By the time observers noticed, the change was profound. It was not sudden collapse, but a steady erosion. Polished behavior masked disintegration. Intelligence, emotion, and memory had been dulled to accommodate expectation. The woman remained present, composed, acceptable, yet she was no longer fully herself. Madness existed behind the façade, private and unremarkable, its existence denied by authority, society, and propriety alike. In Victorian parlors, madness was silent. It did not scream. It did not demand recognition. It whispered through misperception, slippage, and dependence. It lived in the shadows, behind lace curtains and polite conversation, quietly reshaping lives under the guise of care. Here, in private, the consequences of chemical calm became absolute. Paper, ink, and pen became confessional in the dim light of the Victorian parlor. When a woman could not speak freely, when her thoughts were deemed too fragile, too emotional, or too improper to share aloud, she turned instead to letters. These delicate missives, folded carefully and sealed with wax, carried her words into the wider world while maintaining the illusion of control. Yet beneath the elegant script, the subtle curves of penmanship, and the choice of phrasing, a different story unfolded, one of unrest, confusion, and creeping chemical influence. The handwriting betrayed her first. Slanting letters, uneven spacing, irregular pressure. These were the fingerprints of nerves fraying. Friends and relatives, if they noticed, often interpreted these signs as signs of delicate constitution or mild fatigue, never suspecting the deeper truth. To them, a shaky hand was simply a charming marker of femininity, a visual reminder of the fragile ideal they so cherished. The reality, however, was chemical and invisible, silently reshaping cognition and motor control. Words themselves became unreliable. Sentences meandered, thoughts repeated, ideas began and disappeared mid-line. Women described sensations that seemed impossible to share aloud, the room tilting in impossible directions, voices whispering where none could exist, time stretching and contracting unpredictably. Ether had loosened perception. Laudanum had dulled memory. Chloral hydrate had blurred the borders between sleep and waking. The letters recorded these disturbances with a tentative, hesitant hand, as though the mind itself feared its own truth. The content betrayed dependency. Even as women wrote of domestic concerns, social expectations, or polite observations, the letters contained subtle admissions of reliance. References to taking something to rest the nerves, to a dose that helps the mind, appeared repeatedly. lightly tucked into paragraphs as if mentioning them would normalize behavior. What might have been fleeting reassurance in private became ritualized acknowledgement on paper, cementing the link between chemical comfort and daily functioning. Recipients often misread the signs. Family and friends, accustomed to the language of propriety and social expectation, read these letters through a lens of familiarity and affection. They praised careful composition and discreet expression, missing the patterns of dependence and distortion. Occasionally, a concerned sibling or mother might suggest more rest or mild diversion, interpreting odd phrasing as momentary fatigue rather than as evidence of altered cognition. The underlying chemical influence remained invisible, even as it progressed. Letters also became self-reflective. In the act of writing, women often attempted to reconcile the discrepancies they sensed in themselves. They described confusion, lapses in memory, or strange sensations, often qualifying these experiences with disclaimers. "Perhaps I am imagining. It may be nerves. I do not wish to trouble you." These disclaimers were both protective and internalizing, ensuring that the acknowledgement of disturbance remained private and controlled. The letter served as a mirror in which the woman could see her own decline, even as she disguised it for others. This correspondence documented private madness in ways few witnesses could. While medical journals recorded symptoms clinically, letters captured the lived, intimate experience, the subtle fear of losing control, the faint awareness that perception and memory were unreliable, the quiet dread of dependence. They recorded the human cost behind chemical calm, the isolation, the mistrust of one's own mind, and the delicate balancing act of maintaining outward composure. And yet, these letters rarely caused intervention. Recipients, charmed by politeness or reassured by apparent propriety, seldom questioned the prescriptions or routines described. Chemical dependence continued unnoticed, even celebrated when it produced a woman who remained calm, composed, and socially acceptable. The letters, full of careful observation and hidden alarm, became both testament and silence proof that the mind was quietly unraveling behind a veneer of respectability. In the flickering gaslight, letters spoke truths that voices could not. They bore witness to altered perception, subtle hallucinations, creeping reliance, and emotional flattening. And as each envelope was sealed and placed upon the mantel or sent across town, the private madness persisted, chronicled in ink, read as propriety, and understood by no one but the writer herself. They knew. The physicians of Victorian England, educated in the newest chemical sciences, trained in the delicate intricacies of the nervous system, were not ignorant of the effects their remedies produced. They read journals filled with case studies, observed colleagues' experiments, and attended lectures detailing the consequences of prolonged ether inhalation, laudanum administration, and chloral hydrate sedation. Yet knowledge did not always translate into caution. Awareness coexisted with continuation, a quiet complicity wrapped in professional duty. The paradox was rationalized. A woman's mind was considered delicate, her constitution fragile, her nerves constantly threatened by emotion, thought, and circumstance. Any deviation from calm was a symptom of her weakness, never of the medicine. Reports of confusion, hallucination, or dependency were filed meticulously, yet interpreted through a lens that exonerated intervention. The drug did not create deterioration, it merely revealed it. Her mental instability existed long before the bottle touched her lips. Authority protected itself. Doctors spoke confidently to families, patients, and colleagues, framing continuation as necessary care. The nerves must be managed, they wrote. Delicate constitutions demand gentle but consistent regulation. The words reassured households while preserving professional authority. To admit that a chemical could harm a woman's mind would challenge the very hierarchy upon which medical practice depended. Better to prescribe, observe, and rationalize, to continue the course with confidence rather than pause in uncertainty. Some were aware of dependence. Tolerance, escalating dosage, and withdrawal symptoms were recorded. Physicians noted that patients became increasingly reliant on the substances to sleep, to rest, to endure the day. Yet these signs were reframed. Dependence was interpreted as evidence of severity, a confirmation of the fragile constitution. The patient's growing reliance proved the necessity of further administration. The medicine was both the solution and the justification for its own escalation. Professional pride maintained the course. The ability to restore calm, to reduce visible distress, to maintain decorum in the household was valued above all else. Success was measured externally. The patient appeared composed, compliant, and manageable. Internal experience, hallucinations, blurred memory, emotional dulling was secondary. Women were to remain polite, seated, and quiet. When the mind faltered under chemical influence, the fault was recast as pathology, not treatment. Ethics were constrained by context. Victorian culture celebrated control, order, and propriety. Doctors did not operate in a vacuum. Families, social observers, and societal expectations demanded calm women, regulated households, and invisible labor. To question treatment was to challenge these norms, to confront authority, to acknowledge that a chemical could undermine the very mind it promised to soothe. Continuation was safer, simpler, socially sanctioned. Case notes reveal subtle alarm. Some physicians hinted at concern. Patient shows unusual dreams. Memory lapses. Noted. Occasional confusion persists. These observations were brief, clinical, detached. No cautionary instructions were offered. No adjustments were recommended beyond dosage increases to preserve calm. The language softened alarm into observation, recording evidence while permitting practice to continue unimpeded. The patients themselves rarely knew. Women trusted the very authority that endangered them. Instructions were followed meticulously, compliance rewarded with superficial calm. The boundaries between relief and dependence blurred slowly, almost imperceptibly. When confusion or hallucination arose, they questioned themselves before they questioned the doctor. Knowledge resided in the hands of those who continued to prescribe, while the consequences unfolded silently behind curtains and beneath polite decorum. And so it continued. Doctors who knew did not stop. They administered, rationalized, and observed, their professional knowledge deepening the cycle rather than disrupting it. The chemical calm they offered became both a remedy and a trap. The patient appeared restored, obedient, and present, even as her mind drifted into shadows, her will softened, her identity reshaped. Private madness advanced under the guise of care, sanctioned by those who understood its true cost, and yet chose to continue. Marriage, in Victorian England, was often treated as a social remedy before it was a union of hearts. The arrangement promised stability, respectability, and domestic order, a woman's proper place in a well-governed household. Yet beneath the surface of society's grand ideals lay an unspoken understanding. Marriage was also a chemical adjunct, a framework within which obedience could flourish and nerves could be managed with subtle precision. A husband's authority became a supplement to medicine. Women were expected to endure, to moderate, and to suppress distress. Husbands, socialized to enforce propriety and to protect appearances, often encouraged the use of sedatives when their wives faltered. The couple's private lives, framed by social expectation and moral guidance, became a laboratory for control. Ether and laudanum were administered not only by doctors, but also by husbands seeking peace within the household. Calm, they reasoned, preserved dignity; compliance, it seemed, preserved the marriage. The rituals of care were entwined with obedience. A woman's faint tremor, sleepless night, or fleeting irritability became not merely a symptom of nerves, but a domestic concern. A spoonful of laudanum in tea at breakfast, a measured dose of chloral hydrate at night. These interventions were framed as concern, compassion, and love, rather than as tools of control. The household's hierarchy was preserved through chemical calm: a compliant wife, a composed household, a husband relieved of emotional unpredictability. Emotion itself became medicalized within marriage. Grief over loss, anxiety over childbirth, fear of social judgment. These responses were normalized only so far as they could be subdued. A husband's role, reinforced by medical authority, was to ensure that unrest did not disrupt domestic harmony. When the mind threatened to resist, medication became a quiet mediator, shaping moods and temperaments in line with societal expectation. Love and discipline overlapped, chemical intervention invisible beneath the trappings of care. The power dynamics were subtle yet absolute. A woman learned quickly which behaviors invited scrutiny, which signals indicated instability, and which demands might result in increased doses. Social and chemical obedience became inseparable. The presence of drugs made compliance easier, less conscious, and more deeply internalized. Authority, moral and marital, extended into the very nerves and perceptions of the woman, dictating both how she acted and how she felt. Isolation amplified the effect. While households might appear lively and orderly, a woman often experienced emotional solitude. Even surrounded by family, she could not share the inner workings of her mind without risking censure. Letters, whispered confessions, and private journals recorded the toll of chemical management, yet these documents remained unseen, unread, and unacknowledged. Marriage provided both proximity and surveillance, intimacy and control, nurturing and subjugation. Chemical dependence intertwined with domestic expectation. The repeated doses of ether or laudanum became part of marital routine. Relief was celebrated as virtue, compliance rewarded with approval, yet dependence deepened, unnoticed by either party, because the outward markers of propriety were maintained. Calm, rather than agency, became the measure of success. The woman's mind slowly adapted to sedation as the baseline of her existence. In this way, marriage functioned as prescription. It combined social expectation, moral authority, and chemical intervention into a seamless system. Each component reinforced the others: obedience softened by love, authority backed by medical advice, nerves tempered by drugs. The ideal wife was quiet, composed, manageable. The ideal household was orderly, predictable, and socially respectable. All of this was achieved without overt coercion, yet the cost was profound. Identity, emotion, and agency quietly diminished under the combined weight of marital and medical authority. By the end of this chapter in a woman's life, calm was no longer merely relief. It was the product of ritual, chemistry, and social control, and obedience reinforced at every level, sanctioned by love and masked as virtue. The prescription of marriage, like the prescription of medicine, reshaped the mind with subtle insistence, bending it toward compliance until the boundaries between choice and duty, desire and expectation, vanished entirely. The night arrived as it always did, slowly, inevitably, and full of expectation. Gas lamps flickered against the walls of the parlor, casting shadows that seemed to move with their own will. The streets outside whispered with distant cartwheels and the faint shuffle of night watchmen, but inside, the silence pressed heavier, more intimate. For Victorian women, night was a space of vulnerability, a space where thoughts, previously disciplined under daylight scrutiny, could wander freely, and where the consequences of chemical calm could reveal themselves most fully. Sleep was rarely natural. The body had been conditioned for obedience, the mind softened by routine, yet nerves remained persistent. Thoughts circled, worries magnified, and memories that had been buried beneath daylight performance rose once more. Grief, longing, fear, all returned with a clarity denied during the measured day. The hours stretched taut, the darkness itself seeming to press against the eyelids. A woman lay in her bed, framed by starched sheets and heavy curtains. Aware that the coming hours demanded endurance, she had little hope of managing alone. The solution was chemical: ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate. The familiar trio offered the promise of unconsciousness, or at least the illusion of it. Each substance arrived with precise instruction, its efficacy praised in journals, its safety presumed in practice. A measured dose in tea or on the tongue became ritualized, a small act promising control over the chaos of the night. The relief, immediate at first, was intoxicating in its efficiency. Thoughts dulled, awareness softened, the pressing weight of consciousness lifted for fleeting moments. Yet the relief was incomplete. Sleep induced by chemicals did not follow the natural rhythms of the mind or body. Dreams fractured into strange, vivid episodes, or vanished entirely, leaving the sleeper with a hollow sense of rest. Hours passed unanchored, as though time itself had lost its bearings. When consciousness returned, there was disorientation, a fog over memory, a sense of unreality clinging to the edges of perception. The mind, trained to obey, struggled to reconcile what had been experienced with what was remembered. Isolation amplified the danger. Even in households bustling with family, the Victorian woman was alone in her experience. Her restlessness could not be shared. Any mention of difficulty risked judgment. She might be told her nerves were too delicate, her constitution insufficient, her mind prone to exaggeration. Letters captured fragments of the struggle, but these were private, silent, and often unread. The night became a personal theatre of endurance, moderated only by the substances designed to quiet her. Dependence crept in imperceptibly. Each sleepless night strengthened the association between chemical intervention and survival. A missed dose transformed anxiety into panic. Awareness sharpened into agitation. The very act of rest became contingent on obedience, compliance with instruction, adherence to ritual, and submission to authority. The line between necessity and habit blurred. The mind came to anticipate sedation as the only path to tolerable night. The household interpreted compliance as virtue. Polite behavior, measured speech, and composed manners reinforced the belief that medicine was beneficial. When the woman awoke, able to perform her duties, society celebrated the calm she displayed. The internal cost fogged memory, dulled emotion, diminished agency remained invisible. Obedience had been achieved, and that sufficed. Night became a measure of control. Every long hour of darkness was an opportunity for the mind to test itself, and for chemical calm to assert its dominion. Fear, fatigue, anxiety, grief, all were softened, contained, and deferred until the morning light. The quiet victory of compliance came at the price of clarity, leaving the woman both present and absent, disciplined yet diminished. Thus the sleepless Victorian night arrived, again and again, as a crucible of endurance. It was a time when the mind was exposed, the body constrained, and chemical intervention both savior and captor. And by the faint glow of gaslight, as shadows stretched and trembled across the parlor walls, the boundaries between rest and surrender, consciousness and compliance began to dissolve, one measured breath, one careful dose at a time. The first institutional door opened quietly, yet it loomed large in the lives of Victorian women. Homes had been the primary arenas for chemical intervention, parlors, bedrooms, and drawing rooms where ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate flowed as prescribed, administered with care and precision. But there came a point when private management failed, when nerves could no longer be subdued at home, when the ritual of dosing could not contain the unrest that persisted beneath the surface. Then the institution beckoned, the asylum, the retreat, the place where society could intervene with formal authority. These early institutions were framed as sanctuaries. The public language spoke of rest, treatment, and protection. Women who struggled with persistent grief, hallucinations, or the consequences of chemical dependence were said to require professional care. The household, unable to manage, was absolved of blame. Doctors could monitor the patient, control dosage, and maintain order. Families were reassured that their daughters, wives, and sisters would be preserved under supervision. The first institutional door was not a prison in description, but a solution. The interior was designed to enforce calm. Rooms were arranged to minimize stimulation. Heavy draperies, muted light. Furniture was fixed, predictable. Daily routines were regimented, limiting the possibility of agitation. The chemical regimen continued, now under the watchful eye of staff. Ether and laudanum were administered with precision. Chloral hydrate enforced sleep. What had begun as private ritual now became institutionally sanctioned. Its control extended beyond the household to trained attendants and supervisors. Observation replaced autonomy. Every movement, every utterance, every sign of distress was noted. Nurses and attendants recorded behaviors, responses to medication, and compliance with routine. Deviations were corrected, discouraged, or medicated away. Privacy diminished. Autonomy was subsumed beneath the authority of the institution. The woman's body and mind were no longer hers alone. Each sigh, each restless shift became evidence, a symptom or a justification for intervention. Diagnosis formalized surveillance. The labels that had been applied quietly at home, hysteria, nervous exhaustion, emotional instability, now carried official weight. Casebooks recorded symptoms and treatment in meticulous detail. Hallucinations, memory lapses, emotional dulling, and dependence were catalogued as evidence of pathology. The drugs themselves were rarely implicated. Instead, institutionalization confirmed the patient's supposed fragility. The first institutional door did not merely admit the woman, it codified her condition. Families often celebrated the transfer. To send a relative to an asylum was framed as an act of care, not coercion. Relief for the household was immediate. A daughter no longer required constant monitoring. A wife no longer challenged domestic order. A sister no longer disrupted routine. Compliance became externalized. Obedience was now enforced by architecture, staff, and chemical routine. Calm, once private, was now formalized. Isolation magnified the effects of sedation. Cut off from familiar faces, from home routines, from personal agency, women experienced the full force of institutional control. Ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate were administered predictably, steadily, without negotiation. Dependency was reinforced, identity softened, and perception altered. Hallucinations persisted, but without private letters or confidantes, the women could articulate nothing. Reality itself began to fracture in controlled, measured ways. The first institutional door marked a transformation. Chemical dependence that had been discreet at home became absolute under supervision. The woman's mind, already softened by ritual, was now shaped by architecture, authority, and dosage. Compliance was guaranteed, calm was maintained, and the outward signs of propriety remained intact. Yet inside, identity thinned, perception faltered, and the private madness that had begun in the parlor deepened in silence. This was the cost of care made formal. The first door did not slam. It opened quietly, politely, under the guise of treatment. Yet it marked the point at which society took full control of female experience, body, mind, and perception, enforcing obedience chemically, institutionally, and socially with the pretense of protection. And once it closed behind her, the woman's world became measured, controlled, and, for better or worse, completely unfree. The word arrived with authority, elegant on the page and deadly in practice: hysteria. It was the diagnosis that explained everything women were expected to feel but could not show. Nerves, grief, sleeplessness, faint tremors, faint sighs, imagined discomforts, all became symptoms of an unseen disorder. Hysteria was not merely a medical term, it was a lens through which society viewed female existence, a justification for intervention, and a containment strategy for emotion itself. Women rarely questioned it. To be diagnosed with hysteria was both frightening and oddly validating. The label explained behaviors that were previously inexplicable: tears that emerged unbidden, hearts that raced at night, hands that shook despite composure. It justified the doses of ether, the spoonfuls of laudanum, the measured inhalations of chloral hydrate. It told a woman that her distress was not weakness, but medical fact, a delicate system misaligned, in need of careful correction. Physicians described the symptoms in meticulous detail. Casebooks recorded fidgeting fingers, irregular respiration, palpitations, excessive talk, fainting spells, and inappropriate laughter. Doctors attributed these behaviors to overactive nerves, wandering wombs, and emotional excess. The list was long, the rationale compelling. Women were naturally unstable, naturally susceptible to chemical modulation. The diagnosis framed their suffering as inevitable, something inherent rather than situational. Hysteria became the justification for chemical control. Each new dose was sanctioned by medical observation: ether to steady perception, laudanum to soften the edges of thought, chloral hydrate to enforce sleep and restore the frayed system. The medications were no longer treatments, they were instruments, ensuring the patient remained within the bounds defined by diagnosis. Calm became proof of efficacy, dependence was reframed as compliance. A woman's mind, increasingly sedated, reflected the expectations imposed upon it. The home and the institution reinforced the diagnosis. Families, taught to trust medical authority, interpreted symptoms as confirmation. A daughter fidgeting or sighing was nervous. A wife tearful or distracted was hysterical. Institutions codified the behavior, staff recording daily observations, confirming that the prescribed interventions were necessary. The diagnosis created a feedback loop. The more the woman exhibited symptoms, the more treatment she received. The more treatment she received, the more symptoms she exhibited. The language of hysteria obscured cause. Hallucinations, memory lapses, emotional flattening, all consequences of chemical sedation, were interpreted as manifestations of the disease itself. The medications disappeared from scrutiny. The patient's mind was at fault, not the substance. The diagnosis, elegant and comprehensive, allowed society to ignore its own complicity. A woman's private collapse became invisible to those entrusted with her care. Social order demanded this control. Women were expected to be composed, obedient, and accommodating. Hysteria explained deviation from these norms without challenging them. A trembling hand or wandering gaze was medical, not moral. Chemical intervention was benevolent, not coercive. The diagnosis reinforced obedience under the guise of care, ensuring the continuation of domestic and societal expectations. Hysteria shaped identity. The label was internalized. Women began to understand themselves through the language of disease, seeing every fleeting worry, every restless night, as evidence of inherent fragility. Agency diminished. Self-perception narrowed. Calm, induced, chemically or socially enforced, became the standard of success. Anything beyond it was interpreted as pathology. By the time the medications and routines were fully entrenched, hysteria had done its work. It defined the woman, her mind, and her behaviors. It legitimized sedation. It erased nuance. And it provided the ultimate excuse for control, ensuring that, under the guise of care, women's minds could be softened, managed, and ultimately reshaped, all while the world outside remained unaware of the quiet violence performed in the name of propriety. The asylum stood quietly on the edge of town, its red brick walls and iron gates promising both protection and separation. From the outside, it was orderly, respectable, almost comforting, a place where delicate women could be cared for, observed, and restored to calm. Inside, however, the reality was far different. The corridors echoed with the faint murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the occasional sob or sigh. The air smelled of antiseptic, coal smoke, and something faintly chemical lingering from the ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate administered regularly to the residents. The architecture enforced stillness. Rooms were designed to minimize risk and stimulation. Furniture was fixed, heavy, and orderly. Windows opened only partially. Curtains and blinds muted light. Every detail of the environment was controlled to ensure that women remained calm, compliant, and observable. Even the layout of the hallways guided behavior. Wide corridors allowed attendants to monitor residents unobtrusively. Doors were heavy to contain movement, and communal spaces were regimented, forcing interaction into predictable patterns. Freedom was measured, managed, and chemically reinforced. Medication continued as routine. The substances first encountered in the home followed the patient into the asylum. Ether inhalations were scheduled, laudanum administered at precise intervals, chloral hydrate used to enforce sleep. The staff, trained in the methods of chemical care, observed reactions meticulously. Tremors, agitation, and hallucinations were recorded in casebooks, but rarely attributed to the drugs themselves. Instead, these symptoms were interpreted as manifestations of nerves, hysteria, or inherent fragility. The administration of medicine became both treatment and surveillance, ensuring control over mind and body alike. Observation replaced privacy. Every gesture, glance, and utterance was noted. Attendants recorded compliance with routine, responses to medication, and the presence or absence of agitation. Sleep patterns, appetite, and speech were monitored, catalogued, and analyzed. Deviations prompted intervention, a whispered warning, a gentle touch, a measured increase in dosage. The woman's autonomy was subordinated to institutional judgment, her body and mind reshaped to align with societal expectations of calm and obedience. Diagnosis guided treatment, but also constrained identity. Hysteria, nervous exhaustion, and emotional instability were confirmed through observation, charts, and the reactions of the residents themselves. The labels justified all interventions, from chemical sedation to enforced routines. The drugs, the architecture, and the staff worked in unison to mold behavior and perception. Calm was measurable. Compliance was rewarded with praise or privileges. Resistance, however subtle, was met with correction, restraint, or increased sedation. Isolation intensified dependence. Even in communal spaces, women were alone in experience. Private thoughts, visions, and fears could not be shared freely without risking censure. Letters and journals were restricted, glimpses of inner life suppressed. Hallucinations, memory lapses, and emotional dulling, often exacerbated by chemical intervention, went unaddressed, leaving women to navigate a disorienting reality alone. Dependence on medication, once optional, became absolute. The asylum masked coercion with care. To the outside world, it was a sanctuary. To the residents, it was a controlled environment in which obedience was enforced chemically, socially, and structurally. Staff operated with authority, medicines reinforced compliance, and the architecture ensured that every action could be observed and guided. By the time weeks passed, the asylum had accomplished its purpose. Women appeared calm, orderly, and manageable. Their presence satisfied societal expectations. Yet internally, identity had thinned, perception had softened, and thought had been reshaped to align with expectation. Private madness, once invisible at home, became structured and systematized. A subtle, pervasive order achieved under the guise of care. The casebooks were tidy, their pages lined and numbered, the ink carefully pressed into the paper. Every entry carried the authority of a man, trained, credentialed, and socially sanctioned. Physicians chronicled symptoms, recorded dosages, and noted behaviors with clinical detachment. To anyone reading from the outside, the records seemed thorough, objective, even compassionate. What they concealed, however, was far more revealing. The lived experience of women reduced to observation, interpretation, and prescription, all filtered through a male gaze. Each patient was described in language that emphasized fragility. Fingers trembled, eyelids fluttered, speech lagged. Doctors catalogued these details meticulously, often citing nervous constitution or emotional excess as the root cause. Hallucinations were noted in passing, memory lapses recorded clinically, emotional dulling summarized as improvement under treatment. Rarely did the casebooks acknowledge the potential influence of the very chemicals they prescribed. Ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate were invisible in these accounts. The patient alone bore the weight of dysfunction. The records served dual purposes. They documented treatment, providing a framework for dosage, timing, and expected responses. They also reinforced authority. By recording every minor deviation, every sigh, every confused glance, the physician asserted mastery over mind and body. Compliance became measurable, disobedience became evidence of pathology. The woman's interior life was reduced to observable behaviors, her complexity flattened into categories, her agency erased. Women were rarely consulted beyond observation. The physician's accounts privileged professional interpretation over personal testimony. Letters or verbal reports from the patients themselves were filtered, summarized, or dismissed. A woman's perception of her own experience was often noted as subjective complaint, qualified, and reframed to align with medical assumptions. Even when a patient described hallucinations or dependence, the record attributed these to hysteria or constitutional weakness rather than chemical intervention. Her words existed only to support the diagnosis. Authority was embedded in the act of writing. The very process of documentation reinforced power. Men wrote, women were observed. Men judged, women were classified. Ink became a tool of governance. The absence of context, social pressures, grief, domestic labor ensured that chemical dependence appeared as natural fragility rather than imposed consequence. The written record, public in its authority but private in its reach, preserved the appearance of care while codifying control. Mistakes and harms were often rationalized. If a woman worsened under treatment, the record explained it as progression of disease, exacerbation of nerves, or failure of constitution. The physician's decisions were rarely questioned. Dosage adjustments were described as prudent, precautionary, or therapeutic. Harm was reframed as inevitability, responsibility displaced from practitioner to patient. The chemical agents, though causally implicated, were absent from the narrative, leaving the woman's mind and body as the locus of error. The records shaped perception beyond the institution. They informed other doctors, guided family expectations, and reinforced societal norms. A daughter whose casebook described tremors and hallucinations became a fragile woman in the eyes of relatives. A wife whose notes recorded dependence was sensitive or nervous. Documentation created precedent, normalized chemical intervention, and provided justification for continued oversight. Through ink and observation, private madness was made systematic. The woman herself disappeared into the ledger, her lived experience reduced to symptoms, dosages, and compliance. Every entry reinforced authority, every notation enforced expectation, every omission concealed consequence. Records written by men became instruments of control, silent witnesses to the subtle reshaping of mind, emotion, and identity that Victorian medicine carried out under the guise of care. Some women entered the asylums with hope. Others were brought reluctantly by families desperate for relief, by husbands seeking order, by doctors enforcing chemical care that the household could no longer manage. In every case, the threshold of the asylum represented a crossing, from domestic oversight into institutional authority, from private struggle into public observation. And yet, for many, that first step marked the beginning of a journey from which they would never fully return. The gates closed softly, almost politely, behind them. Red brick walls, iron railings, and the faint echo of distant footsteps formed the boundary between past life and the regimented reality inside. Visitors were scheduled and monitored. Personal effects were limited. Rooms were stripped to essentials. The environment was controlled, light, sound, and movement all regulated to maintain calm. Daily routines, meticulously timed and supervised, reinforced submission. Ether and laudanum, chloral hydrate, and other sedatives were administered consistently, shaping perception and blurring consciousness. The woman who had once walked freely through her parlor now moved through corridors as part of a system whose rules she could not challenge. Time began to lose meaning. Days were catalogued by medication schedules, meals, and observation periods. Nights were punctuated by enforced sleep, administered doses, and intermittent checks. Outside, the world progressed, seasons shifted, and families continued their routines. Inside, each hour folded into the next, measured by the clock, not lived experience. The women adapted, or, more precisely, they were adapted. Consciousness, already softened by chemical intervention, conformed to expectation, and the sense of self began to recede. Some were temporarily improved. Attendants and doctors recorded outward calm, tremors ceased, tears were controlled, speech became measured. Families praised the progress, interpreting compliance and subdued behavior as recovery. Yet beneath the veneer of composure, minds were unraveling, memories thinning, agency diminished. Hallucinations persisted, subtle but insistent, as the combination of isolation, routine, and chemical sedation altered perception. The patient appeared present, yet was increasingly absent from herself. Letters arrived sporadically, and sometimes not at all. Communication with the outside was limited and monitored. Journals or missives often disappeared into the institutional system, edited or confiscated under the guise of propriety. Voices were constrained. Observations, private thoughts, and pleas for understanding were reduced to fragments. The world that had once acknowledged them faded, replaced by a regimented reality where presence was external, not internal. Return to domestic life was rare. Discharge required perceived improvement. Calm demeanor, adherence to routine, and capacity to function within expected social roles. Many women, however, had been chemically and socially conditioned to the point that independent thought and spontaneous emotion had been diminished. Returning home was not always possible. Families feared relapse, and society could not tolerate disruption. Some women remained in institutions for decades, fading into a quiet existence measured by attendance, behavior, and observation rather than agency. The human cost was profound. These women were alive, but their identities were reshaped. Memories dulled, emotions flattened, and independence eroded. Chemical calm had been achieved, yet at the expense of full participation in life. Some adapted to their new reality, others sank into persistent confusion or private despair. Few outside recognized the subtle tragedy unfolding behind institutional walls, and still, the asylums presented themselves as salvation. They were portrayed as havens of care, sites of treatment, and places where nerves could be managed safely. The truth that many women never fully returned to themselves remained invisible, obscured by the language of propriety, medical authority, and chemical intervention. Behind every locked door, every measured dose, and every observed corridor, private madness continued, silent, unnoticed, and enduring a consequence of care that preserved appearances at the cost of self. Not all women encountered chemical calm in the same way. In Victorian England, social class dictated more than opportunity, wealth, and influence. It dictated access to the very remedies that could soothe or erode the mind. Upper and middle-class households had physicians on call, medicine cabinets stocked with ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate, and the leisure to administer them with precision. In contrast, women of lower status had less access to these substances, and when they did, it was inconsistent, often unmonitored, or substituted with harsher, less refined compounds. Class-shaped experience, determining both the means of sedation and the perception of propriety. The wealthier the household, the more discreet the intervention. A polished parlor, lace curtains, and attentive servants created the perfect environment for chemical care. Doctors were summoned for consultation, prescribing measured doses with confidence. The ritual of administration was integrated into domestic life. A spoonful of laudanum in the evening tea, a few drops of ether when nerves flared, chloral hydrate before bed to enforce sleep. In these homes, the effects of sedation were carefully observed and managed, reinforcing calm, control, and social decorum. The outward appearance of propriety was preserved even as the interior world softened, dulled, and sometimes unraveled. Middle-class women experienced both relief and expectation. They had access to chemicals and medical guidance, but they also bore the weight of social scrutiny. Medication became a tool for maintaining reputation as much as health. Calm was proof of refinement. Compliance was evidence of virtue. Women were taught to measure emotion, disguise distress, and administer their own treatment with the precision of a practiced hand. The result was a life subtly shaped by chemistry, the boundaries of self, defined as much by doses and timing as by personal desire or judgment. Working-class women, however, faced a harsher reality. Access to high-quality sedatives was limited. Remedies were inconsistent, sometimes substituted with dangerous tinctures or poorly measured doses. Medical supervision was sparse. The effects of chemical intervention could be unpredictable, producing agitation, hallucinations, or collapse without oversight. Moreover, the absence of social expectation for refined composure sometimes meant that these disturbances were dismissed as natural temperament or moral failing rather than recognized as chemical consequence. In these contexts, dependence could be just as severe but far less documented, far less controlled. Chemical access thus became a reflection of social privilege. The wealthy could afford moderation, the middle class could enforce propriety, the poor were left vulnerable to both under- and over-treatment. In all cases, however, the substances shaped experience. Nerves were calmed, hallucinations muted, memory blurred, and compliance enforced. Social standing dictated how carefully, discreetly, or violently this shaping occurred. The same drug that provided gentle calm in a parlor could induce confusion, disorientation, or even danger in another household. Doctors reinforced these disparities. Professional attention was concentrated where it mattered socially, the visible, respectable women whose compliance reflected on household and community. The suffering of less privileged women was documented less frequently, and interventions were less systematic. Medicine served not only the body but the social order, privileging those whose compliance maintained appearances and reinforcing inequality in both care and consequence. And so chemical calm was inseparable from class. A woman's social position determined how she experienced sedation, how she was observed, and how her behavior was interpreted. Privilege allowed subtle manipulation, delicate dosing, and the appearance of propriety. Poverty left women exposed to inconsistent treatment, heightened risk, and invisibility. Yet in every circumstance, the same principle held. Chemical intervention shaped perception, moderated emotion, and enforced obedience, its reach limited only by the resources available to the household and the society that dictated its use. In Victorian England, the fog of chemical calm was thickest where it was most refined, but the cost was universal. Minds softened, agency eroded, and identity quietly rewritten under the guise of care. It never arrived with a clamour. The streets did not fill with protesters. Newspapers did not sound alarms. No committees convened to investigate the quiet erosion of minds behind curtains and within polished parlours. Victorian England, so obsessed with propriety, ritual, and moral oversight, remained remarkably blind to the consequences of chemical calm administered to women. Society feared moral decay in public but overlooked the slow, private decay unfolding in bedrooms, drawing rooms, and institutions alike. The illusion of care masked danger. Ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate were framed as remedies, not as agents of dependency, disorientation, or emotional flattening. The language of medicine reassured families. The woman was nervous, delicate, frail. The treatment was precise, measured, necessary. Obedience and calm were celebrated. Compliance validated care. In such an environment, there was no cause for alarm, no visible spectacle to provoke outrage. Society, conditioned to equate stillness with propriety, applauded the outcomes even as the internal cost remained hidden. Discussion of harm was carefully constrained. Medical journals occasionally noted adverse effects, hallucinations, confusion, memory lapses. Some articles hinted at chemical dependence, but these were framed clinically, abstractly, without connecting the dots to social context or cumulative impact. The public, even when informed, interpreted these reports through the lens of feminine fragility. The woman herself was deemed at fault, oversensitive, constitutionally weak, hysterical. Responsibility never rested with medicine, authority, or household expectations. The mechanisms of suppression were subtle. Families, servants, and physicians all participated in an unspoken system of oversight. A woman who expressed concern about the effects of her treatment risked being labeled unstable or ungrateful. Her questions could be reframed as symptoms of nerves or hysteria. Authority, medical, familial, and social combined to ensure that scrutiny of chemical intervention itself remained minimal. By the time concern might arise, the habits of dosing, the rituals of observation, and the patterns of compliance were firmly established. Cultural priorities reinforced silence. Victorian society prized appearances. Calm, composed women reflected well on households. Any disturbance, if visible, threatened social standing. Anxiety, irritability, or overt resistance could be read as moral or social failure, attracting judgment. Chemical calm, by contrast, preserved appearances while quietly shaping perception and behavior. Because the outcomes satisfied social expectations, there was no impetus for moral panic. The illusion of virtue forestalled inquiry, even as minds were softened and dependence grew. Even reformers failed to intervene. Philanthropic societies concerned with women's welfare focused on poverty, labor conditions, and education. Mental health, when discussed, was framed as pathology, not consequence. The very notion that respectable women might suffer due to sanctioned chemical sedation challenged deeply held assumptions, that doctors acted in good faith, that households were benevolent, that female fragility required management. Questioning this reality would have implied systemic failure, an uncomfortable truth that society was unwilling to confront. Thus, moral panic never arrived. No rallies, no investigations, no public outcry. The quiet erosion continued behind closed doors, codified in casebooks, enforced by dosage, and legitimized by social expectation. Women were rendered obedient, calm, and superficially well, even as hallucinations, dependence, emotional flattening, and memory lapses progressed unnoticed. The mechanisms of care themselves became instruments of suppression, and society, content with appearances, refused to recognize the harm. In the absence of alarm, chemical calm reigned. The fog thickened in parlors and bedrooms alike. Minds softened under the guise of care. Agency diminished without protest. And while society praised propriety and composure, the private cost of obedience altered perception, subdued emotion, and quietly unfolding madness remained invisible, its victims silent, unseen, and unacknowledged. The women who worked closest to the patients saw what others did not. Nurses, attendants, and ward staff in Victorian asylums occupied a peculiar position. Neither fully authority nor fully patient, they witnessed the subtle unraveling of minds and the quiet tyranny of chemical sedation. Day after day, they observed tremors that lingered despite ether, hallucinations that persisted under laudanum, and dependence that intensified beneath chloral hydrate. Their proximity gave them knowledge, their rank constrained their speech. They were privy to truths that could never be openly acknowledged. Whispers became the language of caution. In the shadowed corners of hallways, during the quiet lull between rounds, nurses murmured among themselves. "She seems distant," one might say, nodding to a patient whose eyes no longer focused on the present. "The dose seems high tonight," another would reply, voice low, almost fearful. These whispers carried concern, speculation, and fear, but never authority. They were spoken softly because to raise questions was to risk reprimand, censure, or dismissal. Knowledge existed, but it had no power in isolation. Observation revealed patterns. Attendants noticed that calm came at a cost. The same women who appeared composed in the morning could be disoriented in the afternoon. Memories slipped in fragments. Hallucinations were subtle, yet persistent. Shadows in corners, whispered names in empty rooms, the sensation of someone near when the room was empty. They saw patients repeat actions mechanically, dose after dose, ritual after ritual, until the substance dictated behavior more than will or desire ever could. What seemed like compliance was, in fact, the enforced obedience of chemical and social control. Some nurses began to doubt the wisdom of treatment. They had been trained to follow medical instruction, to administer doses precisely, to record observations meticulously. Yet, the evidence they witnessed suggested harm. Minds softened, perceptions altered, emotional depth flattened. A few quietly questioned whether these interventions were truly care or merely convenience for families, protection of propriety, or the maintenance of authority. But doubt was dangerous. To speak it aloud risked professional isolation and reprisal. The structure of the asylum enforced silence. Reports and observations were filtered upward through casebooks and daily logs. Doctors, distant and authoritative, read the entries and made decisions based on notation rather than conversation. Nurses' voices were subordinate. Their insights became data, not counsel. Even when a patient displayed profound disorientation, The explanation defaulted to nerves, hysteria, or constitutional weakness. The drugs themselves, though clearly implicated in observed effects, were never addressed as causal agents. The whispers remained just that: private, cautious, and ineffectual. Moral tension pervaded the wards. Nurses balanced care and obedience, sympathy and regulation. They witnessed suffering, yet were compelled to maintain routine. They saw women becoming dependent, diminished, even frightened, yet their hands administered relief. Empathy and duty intertwined in conflict. They provided comfort while observing harm. Their internal murmurs became the only acknowledgement of reality, the only resistance to the pervasive narrative that sedation equaled care. These whispers documented private knowledge. They recorded in memory, in conversation, and occasionally in clandestine journal entries what the official record denied. A patient's disorientation was noted in quiet tones. A hallucination was described, not to challenge authority, but to make sense of the moment. Small, private acts of recognition preserved fragments of truth, even as the institution codified obedience and calm. Yet, in the end, the whispers had little power. The combination of social expectation, chemical sedation, and hierarchical authority ensured that the knowledge contained in these soft exchanges remained hidden. The women who watched closely, who understood the costs, could observe but rarely intervene. Their concern existed in shadows, a faint murmur against the prevailing order of compliance, propriety, and chemical calm. And so, the whispers persisted, fragile, cautious, and largely unheard, carrying within them the secret acknowledgement of lives quietly diminished, minds softened, and agency quietly erased. The body carries memory that the mind cannot always articulate. In Victorian women subjected to chemical calm, this truth was both subtle and relentless. Ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate dulled consciousness, flattened emotion, and softened perception. Yet the body retained traces of experience that no dose could entirely erase. Tremors persisted, faint and insistent. Palpitations arose without apparent cause. Muscles remembered tension long after the mind had surrendered to sedation. Each dose, each ritualized administration, left its mark in ways that could not be documented, controlled, or fully understood by doctors, attendants, or families. Memory of sensation was not always conscious. A woman might awaken from chloral-induced sleep with a lingering unease, a shadow of terror that she could not name. Ether's influence might leave a faint trembling in the hands or a hollow emptiness in the chest, even when outward behavior appeared calm. Laudanum softened perception, but the body preserved the echo of emotion: accelerated heartbeat during repose, shallow respiration, subtle agitation in response to minor stimuli. These somatic memories were private, imperceptible to observers, yet persistent and insistent. The disconnect between body and social expectation deepened isolation. Families convinced that medication had restored calm failed to recognize subtle physical signs of unrest. Women were expected to perform, to rise, to speak, to compose themselves in ways that suggested health, yet internally the body resisted. Tremors, spasms, and muscle tension reflected a history of sedation and suppression, a private chronicle of repeated chemical intervention. The discrepancy between external presentation and internal experience reinforced the sense of invisibility, of disconnection, and of being misunderstood. Doctors rarely accounted for these traces. Medical journals emphasized observable behavior, compliance, and outward calm. Somatic memory was invisible in charts and casebooks. When a patient's body betrayed subtle unrest, a restless limb, a skipped heartbeat, a fleeting flush, it was interpreted as nerves, hysteria, or constitutional weakness. The influence of chemical intervention itself was rarely acknowledged. The body remembered what society, the institution, and even the mind seemed to deny. This memory shaped future experience. Each dose reinforced dependence. Each episode of sedation engraved itself into the nervous system. Women learned to anticipate the calming effect of medicine, but they also became attuned to the body's reactions. The tremor that preceded administration, the tension that followed emission, the hollow ache that lingered even in the absence of emotion. Somatic memory, subtle but persistent, dictated routine and reinforced ritual, ensuring that obedience was not merely social or chemical, but bodily as well. Pain and hallucination left traces too. Ether-induced distortions, laudanum dreams, chloral's fragmented sleep all altered perception and left physical echoes. A pulse quickened when stimuli became unexpected. Muscle tone shifted during hallucinations, even when the mind believed the experience imaginary. The body, unlike consciousness, could not distinguish between chemical and natural influence. Each reaction became a private record of experience, a catalogue of sensations no one else could read. The body remembered even after women returned home. Discharged from asylums or domestic oversight, women carried the residues of sedation in posture, gesture, and internal rhythm. Anxiety could spike without warning. Tremors could return even in calm environments. The rituals of medication, once daily necessities, were embedded into bodily memory, shaping responses to stress, expectation, and social demand long after direct chemical intervention ended. In Victorian England, chemical calm reshaped not only mind but body. Even when the mind appeared orderly, the body preserved the history of control, tremors, tension, and instinctive compliance that no instruction could erase. It was a quiet, unrecorded testimony, proof that sedation leaves its trace, that obedience is encoded in flesh as well as will, and that the cost of chemical care endures long after the public gaze has turned away. Faith and propriety intertwined seamlessly with chemical intervention. In Victorian England, women were taught that virtue, composure, and obedience were moral imperatives, reinforced daily by sermons, etiquette, and social expectation. Religion permeated the domestic sphere, shaping behavior, thought, and perception. Prayer, ritual, and devotion demanded stillness of body and moderation of emotion, and those who faltered risked moral judgment. In this context, ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate were not only medical tools but instruments that reinforced the values society held sacred. Chemical calm was framed as spiritual harmony. Doctors, families, and clergy often described sedation as a means to restore balance, not merely of nerves, but of soul. A woman who trembled, wept, or resisted expectation was seen as spiritually vulnerable, morally at risk. The administration of sedatives was presented as both care and protection, a safeguard not only against distress, but against sin. Compliance became an act of faith. Calm was equated with moral rectitude. Obedience, chemical or social, was a reflection of virtue. Prayer and medication operated in tandem. Women were instructed to observe devotional practices while their bodies were softened by chemicals. A spoonful of laudanum before evening prayer, chloral hydrate before retiring to contemplation, ether to steady thought during moments of anxious reflection, all became part of a carefully orchestrated routine. The mind, softened and compliant, was more receptive to guidance, more capable of silent endurance, more capable of accepting instruction as divine and medical alike. Religious discipline and chemical sedation reinforced one another, creating an environment in which submission was both expected and internalized. Deviation was moral as well as medical. A woman who questioned treatment, who resisted dosage, or who displayed agitation was not merely unwell, she was morally suspect. Her nerves were evidence of spiritual weakness, her dependence on medication proof of failure to submit fully to authority. The intertwining of faith and medicine blurred responsibility. To falter chemically was to falter morally. To resist instruction was to resist God, family, and society. Authority, religious and medical, converged in the figure of the obedient woman. Ritualized dosing became spiritual rehearsal. Each measured administration reinforced submission. Compliance was sanctified, obedience was rewarded, and resistance was discouraged. Women internalized the expectation that tranquility was the sign of moral and bodily health. The chemical calm that had begun as relief became an ethical imperative. To resist was to risk impropriety. To doubt was to risk guilt. Sedation was transformed from medicine into discipline, enforced by both earthly authority and spiritual expectation. Isolation amplified moral pressure. Within households or institutions, women observed the calm and composure of others, measured themselves against the ideal, and found deviation unacceptable. Letters, journals, or whispered conversations were constrained, ensuring that internal struggle remained private. Chemical sedation became the medium through which moral compliance was physically enacted. The body trained to obey, the mind softened, and the soul oriented toward patience, humility, and enduring stillness. Religious framing obscured harm. Families and medical staff alike interpreted calm and submission as success. Symptoms of chemical dependence, altered perception, or emotional flattening were reframed as virtue or evidence of proper devotion. Hallucinations and memory lapses were moralized as signs of penitence or sensitivity. Faith, which might have offered solace, instead became complicit, sanctifying the very mechanisms that eroded autonomy. By the candlelight of parlor and asylum alike, submission became holistic. Body, mind, and soul were aligned not through choice, but through expectation, ritual, and chemical reinforcement. Obedience, dulled awareness, and emotional flattening were read as virtue. In Victorian England, religion and medicine together ensured that the ideal woman was compliant, composed, and chemically softened, her inner life carefully managed, her moral and physical selves indistinguishably intertwined. Authority in Victorian England was measured not only in social rank, but in reputation. A doctor's word carried weight beyond the clinic, extending into the parlor, the household, and the broader community. His decisions shaped not only the treatment of the body, but the interpretation of behavior, emotion, and thought. Women, trained from childhood to trust male authority, deferred instinctively, accepting guidance without question. The physician's reputation became a shield protecting practice, doctrine, and social expectation, often at the expense of the patient's inner life. The woman's mind became the site of judgment. Symptoms that might have been responses to grief, loss, fatigue, or the pressures of domestic life were interpreted as signs of fragility, hysteria, or constitutional weakness. Tremors, tearfulness, hallucinations, and confusion were attributed to inherent instability rather than chemical intervention. The mind itself was pathologized, a proof of delicacy or defect, while the treatments ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate remained above scrutiny. The doctor's reputation guaranteed this interpretation, shielding the chemical regimen from criticism. Treatment was inseparable from authority. A prescription was more than a recommendation. It was a directive. Compliance was expected, obedience rewarded with reassurance or praise. A woman's self-doubt was compounded by the perceived expertise of the physician. If relief failed to arrive, she assumed her own inadequacy rather than the limits or consequences of the medication. Dependence, confusion, and emotional flattening were internalized as evidence of her nerves, not of the substances intended to calm them. The doctor's reputation eclipsed lived experience. Casebooks codified this imbalance. Entries detailed dosage, behavior, and observed symptoms, emphasizing the woman's fragility and obedience. Deviations from expected responses were recorded meticulously, often rationalized as worsening condition or heightened nervousness. Rarely did the records acknowledge that chemical intervention could alter cognition or perception. The physician's authority, backed by education, social position, and professional standing, framed these entries as objective, trustworthy, and definitive. The woman's experience existed only as data, mediated through male interpretation. Public perception reinforced professional protection. Society celebrated the doctor who could restore calm, manage nerves, and enforce propriety. Families praised the success of treatment based on composure, compliance, and outward health, never questioning the methods or the unseen consequences. In this way, reputation functioned as a social shield, insulating practice from scrutiny and discouraging dissent. The authority of the physician overshadowed the reality of the patient, ensuring that subtle harms remained invisible, even as the mind quietly shifted under chemical influence. Risk was managed, but unevenly. The same interventions that produced obedience and calm could also deepen dependence, erode memory, and distort perception. Women struggled to articulate the creeping effects, and when they attempted to do so, their concerns were reframed as symptoms rather than valid critique. Reputation protected the doctor from blame, while the patient's experience, fragmented, dulled, hallucinatory, remained private. Obedience and calm were praised, autonomy and perception were devalued. The tension between authority and mind persisted. A woman's thoughts, once her own, were increasingly interpreted as evidence of condition rather than truth. The doctor's word defined reality, and chemical intervention enforced it. Compliance became a measure of success, resistance a symptom of disorder. Every dose administered, every observation recorded, reinforced the imbalance between professional reputation and lived experience. By the time weeks or months passed, the woman's interior life had been quietly reshaped. Her mind, dulled by sedatives and softened by authority, measured itself against expectation. Her perception and judgment bent toward compliance. The doctor's reputation remained intact. Her consciousness was subdued. Calm, composure, and obedience had been achieved, but at the cost of agency, clarity, and the ability to trust her own mind. In Victorian England, professional authority prevailed over perception, and the woman's mind became the silent battleground for control, medicated and monitored under the guise of care. Death, in Victorian society, was never far from life. Loss lingered in parlors, in letters, in mourning garments, and in whispered recollections. Yet for women already softened by chemical intervention, grief became a complicated, dangerous companion, one that could be managed, delayed, or flattened, but never truly escaped. Ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate offered temporary reprieve, yet the very substances that promised calm could also intensify isolation, dependency, and emotional erasure. In this way, a woman could survive bereavement while her interior life quietly eroded, a state that might be called chemical widowhood. The first encounters with death were measured. A husband or father might fall ill, or a child might pass quietly in a bedroom steeped in coal smoke and medicinal vapor. Women were expected to maintain composure, to observe propriety, and to manage their own sorrow. A dose of laudanum to dull the ache, a spoonful of ether to soften agitation, a measured inhalation of chloral hydrate to enforce sleep. These became tools for survival. The rituals of chemical administration were indistinguishable from the rituals of mourning. Calm was expected, obedience was required. Suffering, if visible, was considered evidence of nerves rather than grief. Isolation compounded the effect. Mourning women often retreated to their rooms, drawing curtains against sunlight that seemed too harsh for their fragile state. Attendants, when present, monitored compliance with routine and medication, ensuring that outward behavior met expectation. Letters, journals, or whispered confidences provided limited outlets for expression, yet these were fragmented, censored, or unread. Chemical sedation replaced social consolation, soothing the nerves while suppressing the spontaneous processes of grief. The woman was physically present, but emotionally suspended, her interior life partially anesthetized. Dependence deepened silently. The substances that offered temporary relief became essential. Sleep would not come without chloral hydrate. Anxiety could not be endured without laudanum. Ether dulled the recollection of loss just enough to allow performance of duty and propriety. The mind, already softened by chemical intervention and societal expectation, learned to rely upon these agents, creating a feedback loop. Grief intensified reliance. Reliance dulled perception. Dulled perception preserved calm. Submission was maintained chemically as much as socially. The household observed, misinterpreted, or ignored. Families, concerned for propriety and appearances, interpreted the woman's dependence as careful management. She remained quiet, obedient, and composed. Tears were softened, agitation muted, protest quelled. Outwardly, the household was preserved. The mourning woman conformed to expectation. Inwardly, however, her consciousness was dulled, her emotional range diminished, and her sense of self gradually attenuated. The chemical veil created a semblance of survival while erasing the vividness of experience. Death itself became a tool for control. As more grief accumulated, the passing of relatives, the decay of social networks, chemical sedation smoothed the emotional landscape. The woman adapted, but at a cost. Memory, intensity of feeling, and instinctive response to loss were all subtly altered. What remained was calm, compliant, and observable, yet incomplete. Life continued, but interior experience was muted, constrained, and reshaped by chemicals and expectation alike. Chemical widowhood, therefore, was both protection and erasure. It preserved appearance, sustained household order, and prevented overt crisis. Yet it imposed its own kind of loss, of clarity, of agency, of emotional immediacy. Women survived, but parts of them did not. Grief became measured, memory softened, and identity gradually adapted to obedience. The substances that promised relief carried a hidden toll. The quiet, unacknowledged disappearance of what it meant to fully feel, fully remember, and fully exist after loss. In this way, Victorian medicine and society ensured survival, obedience, and calm, but only by exacting the price of interior life itself. Chemical widowhood was the silent inheritance of grief, a testament to the quiet control exerted under the guise of care. Silence was enforced not only by medication but by expectation. In Victorian England, women were taught from childhood that emotion must be contained, that expression beyond measured bounds was improper, and that any sign of internal disturbance reflected moral as well as physical weakness. Trembling hands, restless sleep, tears, or fleeting anger were not merely personal failings. They were evidence that a woman had transgressed the delicate ideal of propriety. Into this culture of restraint, ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate were introduced, offering chemical calm as both remedy and enforcement. The language of shame intertwined seamlessly with chemical dependence. Shame dictated perception. A woman who experienced unrest after a day of composure was taught to interpret it as failure. Her own body, mind, and thoughts became accusatory voices. I am too fragile. I am too emotional. I am not as I ought to be. Nerves, hysteria, and chemical dependence reinforced this internalized judgment. The subtle tremor in the hand, the lingering tear, the faint racing of the pulse were not merely physiological, they were moralized. The woman learned to feel guilty for what she could not control, for the sensations that persisted despite sedation. Medical authority codified these lessons. Doctors recorded symptoms meticulously in casebooks, always framing them as evidence of constitutional weakness. A woman who required repeated doses was described as having severe nerves, emotional excess, or instability. Hallucinations, memory lapses, and emotional flattening were interpreted as manifestations of fragility rather than consequences of chemical intervention. The language used, precise, formal, and detached, carried implicit judgment. By labeling the patient, the doctor reinforced the expectation that she should be ashamed of her own mind and body. Families amplified the effect. Husbands, parents, and siblings, concerned for social perception, emphasized propriety and composure. Questions about medication or altered behavior were discouraged. Emotional expression was corrected, monitored, or medicated away. Compliance became both social expectation and moral imperative. Outward calm became a shield against shame. Internal turmoil became a source of private guilt. The very tools meant to restore peace, the chemical interventions reinforced a persistent sense of inadequacy. Shame became internalized through routine. Daily rituals of medication ensured that chemical calm and moral expectation were inseparable. Each dose of laudanum or chloral hydrate, each measured inhalation of ether, reinforced the lesson. A woman must be subdued to be acceptable. When calm failed, the body and mind were interpreted as faulty. Dependence was read as weakness. Hallucinations were evidence of instability. Every observable failure confirmed the moral narrative already ingrained by society and reinforced by chemistry. Letters, journals, and private thoughts recorded silent acknowledgement. Women documented unease in muted tones. "I fear I am not well. My nerves trouble me still. I cannot sleep without aid." These were not pleas for intervention. They were confessions of perceived moral and emotional failure. The language of shame intertwined with the language of medicine. Weakness became pathology, dependence became personal failing, and compliance became virtue. Even recovery carried its own burden. A woman who appeared calm after treatment, whose body and behavior aligned with expectation, still bore the weight of awareness, the knowledge of dependence, the memory of unrest, and the persistent sense that her mind had betrayed her. Calm was achieved, but at the cost of dignity and agency. Compliance and sedation were lauded. The internal struggle was erased from observation but etched into consciousness. Thus, the language of shame became an instrument of control. It was silent, pervasive, and reinforced by chemical intervention, medical authority, and social expectation alike. Women learned to measure emotion, to distrust perception, and to submit not only to authority, but to their own internalized judgment. In Victorian England, the true measure of propriety was not behavior alone. It was the quiet obedience of mind and body, enforced chemically and morally, and maintained under the relentless whisper of shame. Progress, even in medicine, is measured in incremental shifts. Ether, once heralded as a miraculous innovation, gradually revealed its limitations. Its volatility, once celebrated as elegant and efficient, became a source of concern in subtle, inconvenient ways. Physicians observed patients whose cognition dulled, whose perception warped, whose dependence grew quietly with each administered dose. The very chemical that had promised calm and compliance now demonstrated the boundaries of its efficacy. Yet Victorian society, eager to maintain appearances and authority, continued to valorize the substance even as evidence of its dangers accumulated. The early promise of ether had been undeniable. In surgical theaters, it silenced pain. In private homes, it steadied nerves, softened agitation, and produced immediate relief. Patients appeared obedient, calm, and composed. Families praised the results, medical journals lauded precision, and physicians' reputations flourished alongside the drug's success. The innovation seemed perfect, a tool that bridged science and domestic tranquility, yet the deeper consequences were only slowly recognized, emerging in patterns too subtle to provoke immediate alarm. Dependency revealed itself gradually. Women who inhaled ether for anxiety, sleeplessness, or hysteria began to exhibit tolerance. The initial dose, once sufficient, no longer produced the same calm. Repeated administration became necessary, and the intervals between treatments shortened. Doctors noted these shifts in casebooks, but rationalized them as evidence of worsening nerves or increased fragility. The drug itself was rarely implicated. Instead, the patient's constitution, her sensitivity, her very nature, was held responsible. Perception and cognition were subtly altered. Flickers of hallucination, brief distortions of time, and intermittent disorientation were recorded. Memory became inconsistent, thought processes slowed. Yet these effects were frequently dismissed as manifestations of hysteria rather than consequences of chemical intervention. The boundary between therapeutic effect and cognitive erosion blurred, leaving women increasingly reliant on the very substance that altered their perception. Each dose reinforced the cycle, embedding obedience chemically and subtly reshaping identity. Social structures reinforced continuation. Households, conditioned to value composure and propriety, interpreted calmness as evidence of success. Families trusted physicians' guidance and did not question the drug's effects. A woman who displayed unrest was given additional doses, her behavior explained as fragility rather than chemical influence. The expectations of obedience, compliance, and moral propriety merged with medical authority to ensure that ether's use persisted, even as evidence of harm mounted. Medical discourse responded slowly. Journals and lectures began to report cases of prolonged dependence, cognitive flattening, and emotional blunting. Yet these discussions remained professional, detached, and insufficiently alarming. They were often framed as cautionary, not prohibitive, encouraging refinement rather than cessation. The message was clear. Ether remained acceptable, its risks manageable, its efficacy unquestioned, at least as long as calm and compliance were maintained. Ultimately, the slow decline of ether was as much social as it was chemical. New sedatives and interventions emerged, offering alternatives that promised similar effects with fewer observable disruptions. The medical community adopted these gradually, shifting attention from ether while preserving the broader paradigm of chemical management. Yet the legacy persisted. Women who had inhaled ether, especially repeatedly or over prolonged periods, carried its subtle effects in cognition, perception, and compliance. The body and mind remembered long after professional enthusiasm waned. In the parlor, the bedroom, and the asylum alike, the story of ether illustrates the quiet cost of calm. Celebrated as innovation, valued for obedience, and sanctioned by authority, it maintained appearances while slowly altering the interior world of women. Its decline was gradual, inconspicuous, and incomplete, a testament to the persistence of chemical control, the power of expectation, and the hidden toll exacted under the guise of care. Science marched forward, and with it came new remedies. By the late 19th century, ether's limitations were increasingly recognized. Dependence, cognitive dulling, and subtle emotional flattening were no longer invisible. Yet, rather than questioning the broader paradigm of chemical management, physicians turned to new substances, laudanum's opiate cousins, chloral hydrate refinements, bromides, and early synthetic sedatives, confident that innovation could solve the shortcomings of its predecessor. The promise remained the same: calm the nerves, enforce compliance, and preserve the appearance of propriety. The pattern of chemical intervention continued, unchanged in principle, though dressed in newer compounds. The methodology remained consistent. Each new drug was introduced with precise instruction and careful observation. Dosage, timing, and administration became ritualized, as had been established with ether. Nurses and attendants were trained to enforce compliance. Families trusted the prescriptions, reassured by professional authority and social expectation. Calm was achieved, obedience ensured, and the interior lives of women remained invisible, governed by chemistry as much as decorum. The substance changed, the structure remained. Dependency manifested similarly. Tolerance developed swiftly, as with ether. Initial doses produced relief. Over time, effectiveness diminished, necessitating incremental increases. Physicians documented these adjustments in casebooks, framing them as appropriate management of fragile constitutions rather than as evidence of chemical reliance. The underlying pattern was identical. The patient's mind and body became progressively shaped by chemical intervention, reinforcing submission, dulling perception, and blurring the boundary between relief and reliance. Hallucinations, memory lapses, and emotional dulling persisted. New sedatives offered slight differences in effect. Bromides, for instance, produced slower cognitive function, subtle lethargy, and occasionally tremors, yet the outcomes mirrored the familiar trajectory. The mind softened, compliance increased, and subtle distortions of perception were normalized within the framework of diagnosis. Behavioral observation continued to dominate documentation, while the patient's subjective experience remained marginalized. Chemical intervention was presented as both remedy and measure of success. Social and moral frameworks reinforced continuation. As before, calm was equated with virtue. Compliance was rewarded with praise, and minor disruption interpreted as evidence of pathology. Families, eager to maintain appearances, celebrated the visible effects without scrutinizing internal cost. Women internalized the expectation that serenity was necessary, and that dependence on chemical agents was acceptable, even laudable if it maintained decorum. Authority, both familial and medical, aligned seamlessly to perpetuate the pattern. The cycle extended into institutions. Asylums incorporated new drugs into established routines. Dosing schedules were recorded meticulously, observation continued rigorously, and behaviors were catalogued with the precision of casebooks. Patients were managed chemically, socially, and architecturally. Their autonomy curtailed in the name of propriety and care. What had begun with ether now continued with newer substances, proving that chemical intervention, ritualized obedience, and social expectation formed a resilient system that could absorb innovation without altering its fundamental logic. Innovation masked the underlying cost. Each new drug appeared to offer improvement: fewer visible tremors, steadier sleep, milder side effects. Yet the effect on consciousness, perception, and emotional depth was largely consistent with its predecessors. The exterior calm remained, but interior life continued to diminish. Hallucinations persisted subtly, dependence deepened quietly, and the boundaries of self continued to erode. The pattern had shifted chemically, but not ethically, socially, or experientially. Thus, the lesson remained clear. Progress in sedatives offered novelty, yet preserved the same trajectory. The mind softened, the body obeyed, and society celebrated calm at the expense of agency. In Victorian parlors and asylums alike, new drugs did not disrupt the pattern, they reinforced it, proving that chemical intervention, once normalized, could endure indefinitely, reshaping identity under the guise of care, no matter the era or compound. They existed, yet few remembered them. In the quiet corridors of Victorian asylums and the hidden parlors of well-appointed homes, women succumbed to chemical calm, dependence, and the invisible reshaping of mind. Their names appeared briefly in casebooks, mentioned politely in letters, or whispered by attendants, yet their lives, their struggles, and their experiences were largely erased from collective memory. Ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate, and later sedatives dulled not only perception but visibility. These women were present, performing propriety, yet their interior worlds, nuanced and altered, remained unnoticed. Documentation reduced identity to symptoms. Casebooks recorded trembling hands, irregular sleep, mild hallucinations, emotional flattening, and adherence to routine. Observations were clinical, detached, and impersonal. Names were often abbreviated, experiences summarized, subjective accounts discounted. The woman as person, her grief, her fears, her desires was absent. What remained was a catalogue of fragility and compliance, a series of data points stripped of context or humanity. In these records, the individual vanished, leaving behind a template of nervousness and obedience. Chemical dependence erased personal narrative. Repeated doses of sedatives softened cognition and dulled emotional intensity. Memory fragments disappeared, experiences of fear, loss, and resistance faded. A woman might recognize herself less over time, her interior life increasingly aligned with routine and expectation. Her perception of reality shifted subtly, her agency constrained by expectation and chemical influence. The process was gradual, silent, and deeply effective. By the time observers noted compliance, the woman's individuality had already been smoothed into a version deemed socially acceptable. Society sanctioned invisibility. Families, attending physicians, and social observers celebrated calm, obedience, and propriety. Women who did not resist, who complied with routine and dosage, were considered successful outcomes. Outward composure masked inner turmoil, and the subtle deterioration of mind and identity went unnoticed. Society prioritized appearances over experience, propriety over perception. The women themselves became the quiet instruments through which social order was preserved. Voices were rarely preserved. Letters, journals, and whispered confidences were often lost, censored, or dismissed. When recorded, the contents were reframed as evidence of fragility or hysteria, rather than valid expression. Nurses and attendants, aware of the private suffering, could only whisper among themselves. Their insights rarely penetrated the authoritative casebooks. The patient's own voice, when it existed, was mediated through professional interpretation or filtered by social expectation. Even in writing, she was largely unheard. Time deepened erasure. Years in an institution or under prolonged chemical management blurred identity. Memory of events, relationships, and personal achievements faded under the combined effects of sedatives and routine. By the time discharge was considered, or if it ever occurred, women returned to society, partially reconstructed by chemistry and expectation. The experience, while vivid to them internally, was largely unrecorded externally. They re-entered the world as calm or recovered. Their private histories invisible, their individuality diminished. Forgotten patients illustrate the cost of propriety. Their lives demonstrate how chemical intervention, institutional authority, and social expectation conspired to produce calm, obedience, and superficial stability at the expense of consciousness, agency, and memory. They survived, yet portions of themselves were quietly excised. Their stories, largely undocumented, survive only in whispers, marginal notes, and the subtle traces written into the body and mind. In Victorian England, the price of calm was invisibility. These forgotten patients remain the silent witnesses to chemical obedience, proving that the pursuit of propriety and social order could erase the most intimate facets of human experience without leaving a trace, Even as it preserved outward appearances of health, decorum, and control, the ledger was meticulous, precise, and authoritative. Medical casebooks recorded dosages, symptoms, behaviors, and responses to treatment in neat, careful handwriting. Doctors catalogued tremors, palpitations, irregular sleep, and faint hallucinations, interpreting these as evidence of fragile nerves, emotional excess, or hysteria. Observations were clinical, detached, and unemotional, designed to support the ongoing regimen of ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate. Yet, in every line, in every notation, there existed a vast omission, the unrecorded, unseen, and unacknowledged reality of the women themselves. The interior world was absent. These records documented observable behavior, but not perception. They described compliance, agitation, or calm, but rarely captured the lived experience of the patient. How it felt to watch time stretch under sedation, to experience hallucinations unshared, to feel memory fracture while consciousness remained semi-intact. These realities were omitted entirely. The ledger spoke of obedience, not subjectivity, of ritual, not suffering, of measured doses, not the creeping erosion of identity. Chemical influence was ignored. Casebooks rarely mentioned the very substances that shaped cognition and emotion. Ether's volatility, laudanum's lingering effects, chloral hydrate's distortion of sleep, all were absent from explanatory notes. Any consequence of the drugs themselves was reframed as intrinsic instability. The woman's nerves, her constitution, her emotional disposition. The tools of compliance were invisible in the documentation, leaving the patient's experience fully attributed to nature rather than intervention. Resistance and discomfort were minimized. When women questioned treatment, missed doses, or exhibited agitation, records interpreted these behaviors as further evidence of pathology. A skipped administration was a symptom of fragility. A tremor under sedation was proof of worsening nerves. The ledger erased nuance, collapsing the complexity of chemical dependence, psychological strain, and social pressure into tidy categories: obedient, nervous, compliant, hysterical. The records preserved authority while omitting consequence. The emotional cost was unrecorded. Fear, loneliness, and confusion persisted behind walls and curtains. Hallucinations induced by chemicals, the subtle erosion of memory, and the soft flattening of emotion were experienced daily by women, yet these dimensions of suffering were rarely acknowledged. The ledger chronicled outward calm, ritualized obedience, and measurable responses, but never grief, isolation, or the quiet dread of waking fully aware yet dependent. Emotional reality was invisible to those who judged only observable signs. Institutional mechanisms reinforced omission. Within asylums, surveillance and structured routine emphasized behavior over experience. Attendants and nurses recorded what could be seen. Internal states were inaccessible and, by design, disregarded. Even when nurses whispered concerns or noted subtle distress, these comments rarely entered the official record. Documentation reinforced control. Compliance became the measure of success, and omission of lived experience ensured that chemical dependence and private turmoil remained invisible. Social context vanished. The ledger did not acknowledge grief, poverty, familial pressure, or social expectation. Chemical intervention, moral expectation, and gendered authority combined to shape behavior. Yet records treated the woman as an isolated system, fragile, unstable, and in need of correction. The societal structures that produced dependence and compliance were omitted entirely, leaving the patient wholly accountable for the effects of treatment. What the records omit, therefore, is essential. They erase subjectivity, chemical causation, emotional consequence, and social context. In their silence, they preserve the illusion of propriety and medical authority. Women, once vibrant, thoughtful, and resistant, are reduced to data points. Compliance, calm, and measured response are celebrated, while the interior lives of patients, the creeping dependence, and the private madness that unfolded remain unrecorded, unacknowledged, and hauntingly invisible. In Victorian England, the ledger spoke loudly and yet said almost nothing of the human cost. The patterns of Victorian chemical care did not vanish with the 19th century. Though ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate eventually fell from common domestic use, their legacy persisted. The principles that guided their administration, the assumption of fragile female nerves, the unquestioned authority of physicians, the normalization of chemical calm echoed into modern medical practice in subtle, often invisible ways. Contemporary approaches to women's mental health, prescription of sedatives, and management of emotional distress are informed by historical precedent, the shadow of chemical control lingering beneath the guise of care. Assumptions about fragility persisted. Victorian medicine cast women as inherently delicate, prone to hysteria, and emotionally unstable. These assumptions became embedded in diagnostic language, social expectation, and institutional practice. Even as modern psychology emerged, these biases subtly influenced the framing of female patients. Conditions like anxiety, depression, and insomnia are still disproportionately attributed to inherent sensitivity rather than contextual stressors. What was once pathologized as nerves continues to resonate in attitudes toward emotional expression and treatment. Chemical dependence remains a quiet concern. Modern sedatives, antidepressants, and anxiolytics mirror ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate in their promise: relief, calm, and compliance. Prescriptions are intended to manage distress, yet the risk of dependency, tolerance, and cognitive alteration persists. Clinicians are aware of these risks, but societal and institutional pressures to perform, to maintain propriety, to conform to expectation, continue to shape use. The echo of Victorian reliance on chemical obedience is present in the balance between therapeutic benefit and unintended consequence. Medical authority continues to shape perception. The Victorian model placed absolute trust in physicians, with patient perception marginalized. Today, while patient autonomy is formally recognized, subtle hierarchies persist. Women's self-reported experiences may be discounted, minimized, or reframed through the lens of diagnostic criteria. Complaints about side effects, cognitive dulling, or emotional flattening are sometimes interpreted as symptoms rather than consequences, echoing the historical pattern in which authority and chemical intervention combine to define reality for the patient. Institutional oversight retains its influence. Hospitals, clinics, and psychiatric institutions operate under structured routines, monitoring compliance, administering medication, and recording behavior. While modern standards emphasize informed consent and individualized care, echoes of the past remain in protocols that privilege observable behavior over subjective experience. Sedation, structured routines, and diagnostic authority continue to shape patient experience in ways reminiscent of Victorian asylums. Social expectations reinforce chemical management. Cultural pressures to remain composed, to perform domestic and professional duties, to maintain appearances continue to influence medication use. Women are still conditioned to balance internal experience against external expectation. The need for chemical support often aligns with social imperatives rather than individual choice alone, reflecting a lineage that stretches back to the parlors and asylums of Victorian England. Reflection and awareness are essential. Understanding the historical context of chemical intervention illuminates modern practice. Recognizing the patterns established by Victorian medicine, the conflation of fragility with pathology, compliance with success, and sedation with care, allows clinicians and society to question assumptions, prioritize patient experience, and monitor dependence. Awareness of these echoes is critical to ensuring that treatment supports autonomy rather than subtly enforcing obedience. Thus, the shadow of Victorian chemical care lingers. Ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate may no longer dominate, but the principles that guided their use continue to shape perception, prescription, and practice. Calm and compliance remain prized, dependence persists quietly, and the lessons of history offer both warning and insight. Modern medicine carries forward echoes of the past, challenging us to distinguish care from control and relief from submission. Madness, in Victorian England, was a word carefully applied, measured, and sanctioned by authority. A woman trembling in her parlour, weeping quietly in her bedroom, or losing sleep over grief or anxiety was not simply suffering. She was nervous, fragile, hysterical. Diagnosis and chemical intervention merged, creating a framework in which deviation from propriety, even subtly expressed, was pathologized. Compliance and calm became the standard, while internal experience was erased. Hysteria and nervous disorder were applied as labels to women whose distress reflected not inherent flaw, but the pressures of a society intent on control. In this context, redefining madness was essential, not only for social order, but for chemical and institutional authority. The first step was observation, framed by expectation. Physicians, attendants, and family members catalogued behaviors that fell outside the narrow limits of propriety. Trembling hands, palpitations, fleeting irritability, restless eyes, or imaginative speech were interpreted as evidence of instability. Chemical intervention was immediate and routine. Ether, laudanum, and chloral hydrate were administered to restore calm, regulate behavior, and maintain appearances. When compliance was achieved, calm became a measure of sanity. When behavior resisted control, the label of madness was applied more firmly. Diagnosis erased context. Loss, grief, exhaustion, and social pressure were seldom considered causal factors. The nervous system, delicate and unstable, was blamed instead. A woman's reaction to the burdens of domestic labor, societal expectation, or institutionalization was interpreted as personal deficiency. Hallucinations, memory lapses, and emotional flattening, often the result of chemical intervention, were recorded as symptoms of disorder rather than consequences of treatment. Madness became a mirror reflecting societal assumptions rather than lived experience. Chemical intervention both treated and defined madness. Sedatives dulled perception, flattened emotion, and softened thought. The body and mind, guided by ether, laudanum, or chloral hydrate, conformed to the standards of behavior expected by family, institution, and physician. Obedience was evidence of treatment efficacy. Calm was interpreted as restoration. The subtle erosion of autonomy and perception was invisible to those enforcing the framework. The woman's interior life was irrelevant. Only outward conformity mattered. Madness, in this sense, was as much performance as pathology, defined by the ability to comply chemically and socially. Reclassification became institutionalized. Asylums codified the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Casebooks meticulously recorded symptoms, doses, and compliance, reinforcing the definition of madness as behavioral deviation. Women who adhered to chemical and social expectations were considered sane. Those whose internal unrest persisted, hallucinations, memory lapses, or emotional resistance were diagnosed, sedated, and monitored more intensely. The definition of madness became inseparable from chemical management, observation, and compliance. Social perception reinforced chemical authority. Families, reassured by outward calm, accepted the medical definition. A compliant, sedated woman appeared restored, her past unrest reframed as illness, corrected by treatment. Emotional flattening, cognitive dulling, and ritualized dependence were invisible. The social gaze, satisfied by propriety, endorsed the medical categorization. Madness was thus defined by obedience, appearance, and chemical compliance, rather than by the subjective reality of suffering. Redefining madness ensured social and chemical control. By linking diagnosis to treatment, authority, and social expectation, Victorian medicine transformed internal experience into measurable behavior. Women's minds were shaped by the expectation of calm, the prescription of sedatives, and the observation of authority. Compliance was sanity, disobedience, instability. The boundary between treatment and control blurred, and madness became a tool to enforce conformity, conceal harm, and sustain both chemical and social order. In the parlor, the asylum, and the home alike, madness was no longer merely an internal condition. It was a construct defined by others, enforced chemically, measured behaviorally, and sanctioned socially, a reflection of expectation rather than reality, of obedience rather than perception. In Victorian England, to redefine madness was to redefine the self, bending identity to propriety and sedation, ensuring that women were controlled even as they appeared composed. Silence came first. Not the silence of peace, but the oppressive, measured quiet that Victorian society demanded of its women. A woman's nerves, emotions, and perceptions were to be contained, disciplined, and regulated, her interior world carefully curated to reflect propriety. When chemical intervention entered the home or institution, ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate reinforced that silence. The substances dulled thought, softened reaction, and flattened emotion, producing calm that was outwardly visible but internally coercive. Every dose imposed a quiet obedience, teaching women that unrest, complaint, or resistance was both improper and dangerous. The silence extended into experience. Women learned not to speak of hallucinations, memory lapses, or the subtle distortions of perception that accompanied chemical sedation. Letters, journals, and whispered confidences captured fragments of interior life. But these were few, scattered, and often suppressed. Family members, attendants, and physicians interpreted calm as success, composure as health, and obedience as evidence of effective treatment. Anything beyond that doubt, fear, or awareness of chemical influence was discouraged, misread, or silenced entirely. The interior world became private, unrecorded, and isolated. Chemical dependence reinforced silence. The substances that promised relief also demanded compliance. Ether's volatility dulled urgency, laudanum softened emotion, and chloral hydrate enforced sleep. Women came to rely on these interventions to endure daily life. Yet reliance was hidden, internalized, and rarely acknowledged. The fear of being judged fragile, hysterical, or improper prevented disclosure. Dependence became invisible, and silence was maintained, not only socially, but chemically. Every dose taught submission, every ritualized administration reinforced quietude, every enforced calm validated authority. Isolation magnified the cost. Even within households or asylums, women were largely alone in their experience. Emotional or cognitive disruption could not be shared openly. Observers recorded only what was visible: composure, adherence to routine, and outward calm. The private turmoil, hallucinations, distorted perception, or creeping confusion was invisible to all but the woman herself. The more she internalized observation, expectation, and chemical regulation, the more isolated she became. Silence, reinforced by authority and medication, became both shield and prison. Social expectation compounded chemical effects. Society demanded composure, restraint, and compliance. Deviations from expectation, irritability, tearfulness, resistance were pathologized as weakness. Obedience, measured externally, was praised. Emotional suppression, even under chemical sedation, became a marker of propriety. The social gaze, coupled with chemical intervention, ensured that women learned to trust external authority over their own perception. Their interior experiences, their discomfort, their resistance, were rendered irrelevant, invisible, and unspoken. The cost of silence was profound. Memory eroded, emotional depth flattened, and the capacity for self-expression diminished. Agency became conditional, permitted only when aligned with expectation and chemically reinforced. The body, shaped by repeated sedation, remembered what the mind could not articulate. Dependence persisted, subtly shaping thought, perception, and behavior. Women survived, and even appeared, yet essential aspects of consciousness, awareness, autonomy, and interior life were quietly diminished. Silence ensured compliance, but it demanded surrender. By the time families and institutions recognized calm as success, the mind had already been softened, perception reshaped, and selfhood partially effaced. Women learned that to speak, to protest, or to acknowledge internal unrest was unacceptable. Compliance and quiet were rewarded. Dissent and disclosure punished or ignored. The external appearance of propriety was preserved, but at the cost of internal truth. In Victorian England, the cost of silence was both subtle and absolute. Chemical calm, social expectation, and authority collaborated to produce obedience, suppress distress, and erase interior experience. Calm became a measure of success, quiet, a moral imperative, compliance, a surrogate for health. The price of propriety was the erasure of voice, the diminution of perception, and the invisible shaping of the mind itself. Calm, once celebrated as relief, slowly became the instrument of control. In Victorian England, the pursuit of composure and propriety shaped not only social expectation, but the administration of medicine. Ether, laudanum, chloral hydrate, and other sedatives promised to soothe nerves, quiet agitation, and enforce stillness. At first, this calm appeared beneficial, a relief from sleepless nights, grief, and anxiety. Yet, over time, the line between treatment and domination blurred. Calm was no longer merely the alleviation of distress. It became a standard to which women were compelled to conform, a measure of obedience enforced chemically, socially, and institutionally. The mechanisms of control were subtle. Doses were precise, schedules rigid, and observation constant. Nurses and attendants, trained to monitor adherence, ensured that ritualized administration reinforced both compliance and calm. In households, families praised composure, equating it with virtue and health. Disobedience, unrest, or hesitation was interpreted as pathology. Over repeated cycles, women learned to internalize expectation, aligning perception, behavior, and emotion with the demands of authority rather than their own experience. Chemical calm ensured that obedience was both enforced and accepted. Perception itself became regulated. Ether dulled awareness, laudanum softened reaction, chloral hydrate enforced sleep. With each administration, the mind's responses were muted, boundaries of sensation softened, and emotional intensity flattened. Hallucinations, memory lapses, and distorted perception were normalized, reframed as symptoms of nerves rather than the effects of sedation. The woman's inner life was quietly subordinated to the ideal of measured calm. Compliance and stillness became the markers of propriety, and over time, perception adjusted to meet expectation. Institutions codified obedience. Asylums and hospitals structured days, rooms, and routines to enforce calm. Observation, measurement, and chemical intervention were interwoven. Casebooks recorded adherence, noting tremors, agitation, or hallucination as deviations requiring further intervention. Patients learned to anticipate sedation, to associate compliance with reward, and to internalize authority as self-guidance. Obedience became habitual, performed without conscious choice, reinforced both by chemical influence and social expectation. Family and society reinforced the system. Households interpreted calm as success, composure as evidence of effective care. Outward appearance masked interior disruption. Women were celebrated when they conformed, admonished when they faltered. Chemical intervention, social expectation, and moral judgment operated in concert to ensure submission. The more obedient the body and the quieter the mind, the more socially acceptable the woman appeared. Calm became synonymous with control, and control with propriety. The cost was internal and enduring. Identity, agency, and emotional richness were quietly eroded. Memory of events, intensity of feeling, and spontaneity of thought diminished under repeated sedation and enforced calm. Women survived, their outward appearance preserved, yet parts of their consciousness were reshaped, dulled, and partially erased. Dependency on chemical intervention reinforced submission, while the internalization of social and moral expectation ensured that compliance persisted even without supervision. By the flickering glow of gaslight and the hush of parlor and asylum, calm had become absolute. It was no longer merely relief, it was a mechanism of obedience, a subtle instrument of authority, and a tool for maintaining social and institutional order. Every measured dose, every whispered admonition, every observed gesture reinforced the expectation. The woman must be composed, subdued, and compliant. The ideal of calm, once intended as care, had become a form of control absolute, pervasive, and enduring. In Victorian England, then, the pursuit of serenity was inseparable from the assertion of power. Chemical intervention, social expectation, and institutional authority converged to enforce it. Calm was not optional, comfort was not neutral, and compliance was rewarded while autonomy quietly vanished. The price of propriety was the surrender of self, and in the end, calm was the most exacting form of control ever imposed under the guise of care.